Adored by the Cowboy, written by Liwen Ho. Copyright 2019. Chapter 1. Lexi. Lexi Turner had never seen a more delicious pot of chili, or maybe it was the gorgeous Cowboy stirring the pot who had her mouth watering. "Can I move now, Lex?" a low, rich voice asked. She blinked quickly behind the lens of her camera and lowered the Nikon DSLR from her eye. The camera strap tugged on the back of her neck as she let the equipment fall from her hands. Clearing her throat, she squeaked out, "Yeah, totally. I got the shots I needed. Thanks, James." The tall man wearing dark jeans and a fitted gray t-shirt under a large white apron straightened from the pose he'd been in for the past few minutes. His expression relaxed, adding a sparkle to his blue eyes. He immediately pulled the apron over his head of auburn waves and tossed it onto the metal counter behind him. Finally. I don't know how much longer I could have held that smile. And I'm pretty sure the chili would have turned to mush if I stirred it any more. You know, I can't be caught serving baby food to our ranchers. Lexi chuckled to see the right corner of James's lips curve up in his trademark grin. Her friend always seemed to smile with just one side of his mouth, never fully revealing his straight, white teeth. He was the strong, silent type, like a stereotypical cowboy from the Clint Eastwood movies her dad liked to watch. You know, those guys will eat anything you put on their plates. You're the best cook in Texas. A slight blush crept up James's neck, adding color to his defined jawline. You're much too kind, Lexi. And a sweet talker if I've ever met one. I doubt if a year on the ranch has made you an expert on Southern cooking, but I'll take the compliment. He nodded toward the stainless steel pot sitting on the stove. Do you want a bowl before you get back to work? Sure. But only if you sit with me and have one too. James checked the clock hanging on the wall. I can manage that. I've got an hour before I need to start on the rest of dinner. He scooped out 2 bowls of steaming hot chili, grabbed 2 metal spoons, and led the way out of the kitchen. Lexi followed him into the mess hall reserved for the employees. An earthy aroma of dirt, mixed with the freshness of spring rain coming in through an open window, filled her senses. Half a dozen picnic tables topped with metal napkin dispensers took up the majority of the large room. Several tracks of muddy footprints revealed a path where the rancher's boots had walked hours earlier during lunch. Lexi's own pair of boots clicked along the concrete floor, feeling foreign and comfortable on her feet at the same time. Sometimes she still couldn't believe she'd traded in her flip-flops and a life by the beach for country living. But that's what a semi-midlife crisis had prompted her to do when Thomas left her for another woman. Taking a seat on one of the wooden benches, she set her camera on the table. She also cleared her head free from any more thoughts of her ex-husband. She inhaled the savory scent of spices rising from the bowl James set before her and sighed. This is just what I need. Spice therapy. From across the table, James held out his spoon to her and waited for her to clink it with her own before digging into his bowl. In between bites, he met her gaze curiously. Something tells me you're not just talking about the Monday blues. Did your mom call again? Lexi blinked in surprise. How'd you know? He shrugged. You've been distracted ever since you walked into my kitchen. Distracted was right. Lexi didn't know what had gotten into her today. Seeing her good friend through a camera lens had somehow magnified her view of him. She'd thought he was handsome when they first met, but she had never studied the planes and angles of his face so closely before. Or it could be that she'd been too heartbroken to notice. After relocating from the big island of Hawaii to Sage Valley, she'd spent months grieving the end of her decade-long marriage. It wasn't until recently that her heart had started to ache less. When the Dude Ranch owners, the Buchanans, tasked her with the job of taking pictures for their website, she'd rediscovered the joy of photography. And now apparently, she'd also discovered the opposite sex. Lexi winced. She really ought to be acting her age instead of feeling like a hormonal teenager. She was a week from turning 40, for goodness sakes. Midlife crisis or not, she couldn't be crushing on her much younger friend. Feeling James's eyes on her, she swallowed her mouthful of chili and answered quickly. You guessed right. My mom did call this morning, bright and early at 7:02 in the morning her time, just before she turned into bed. She had some big news that couldn't wait. James quirked a brow, his telltale sign urging her to continue speaking. Apparently, Thomas got engaged over the weekend. Ouch. Lexi ducked her head. The hem of her red flannel shirt skimming the top of her jeans blurred for a second before she blinked away her tears. She sniffled as she looked up. I couldn't care less what he does. It's more the fact that my own flesh and blood still keeps in touch with the guy who broke my heart that gets to me. My mom really loves poking her nose in other people's business. A pained look crossed James's face as he rubbed his chin. I'm sorry, Lex. That's gotta sting. I thought my great-aunt won the award for meddling, but your mom takes the cake. She smirked. Sharon Buchanan, or Nana as everyone called her, had a reputation for playing matchmaker, but at least she had good intentions. Lexi's typical Asian tiger mom, bless her heart, didn't have a sensitive bone in her body. Lexi still didn't know how her fun-loving, Irish father had won her over. It's all right. I just keep reminding her that I've moved on. I'm happy with my life now. I've rediscovered my love of photography, I've got the ranch's store to manage, and, she gave him a pointed look, I have amazing friends. He narrowed his eyes. Are you talking about Charlie? He asked, referring to Lexi's cousin who had gotten her the job at the ranch. She licked her spoon before setting it down. Not just Charlie. I'm talking about you, too, Mr. James Scott. Like I said, your chili is life. Just one bite of it, and the world seems right again. She glanced down at her empty bowl, then pointed a finger at her mouth as she smiled. See how happy you've made me. I hardly remember my conversation with my mom now. James chuckled, the throaty sound causing his Adam's apple to bob. I'm happy to oblige. I've got a whole pot left of this spice therapy if you want some more. Lexi shook her head. Thanks, but I should get back to the store to relieve Henry. She had one employee, a part-timer who was in line to get a permanent job as a ranch hand. I'll upload these photos and ask Nana which one she wants to use. If my guess is right, she'll say all of them. I'm pretty sure you're her favorite grandnephew, she added with a wink. Nah, I'm just the one she managed to rope into working here. Well, I'm awfully glad she did. If you hadn't come back to the ranch, we'd never have met. You've made this past year so much brighter. James gave her a half smile. You mean tastier? Definitely both. Feeling grateful, Lexi reached across the table and placed her hand on top of his. A light spark of electricity shot through her fingers the moment they touched. She immediately pulled back and rubbed her palm along her jeans. Had James felt it too? Are you okay? Yeah, totally fine, Lexi replied, lying through her teeth. Her body had never reacted to James this way before. She eyed the camera on the table, wondering if it had cast some sort of spell on her. Before she could dwell any more on the matter, her cell phone vibrated. She pulled it out of her back pocket and swiped it open to reveal a new message. Lex, are you sitting down? She read. It's Charlie, she murmured to James as she watched 3 dots flash across her screen. She's probably texting to vent about some crazy request she got from a guest. Charlie's next message popped up. I don't know how to tell you this, but Thomas is here. With a young blonde thing wearing a huge rock. The blood drained from Lexi's face. Her mouth fell open as she stared at the blue text bubble. What were her ex and his new fiancé doing in Sage Valley? Lexi? What's wrong? She bit her bottom lip as she met James's gaze. I think I'm going to need another bowl of chili. Chapter 2. James. James Scott looked over at his good friend as she sat staring wordlessly into her third bowl of chili. He hadn't seen Lexi this upset since she first moved to Sage Valley a year ago. He still remembered how she'd walked into his kitchen in flip-flops, her bright pink toenails caked in mud. Elvis, their cranky ranch rooster, had given Lexi the royal welcome, squawking and chasing her about until she slipped and fell into a muddy puddle. At Charlie's prompting, he'd brought out a bowl of chili for Lexi and let her nurse her bruised ego with the bold flavors of cumin, coriander, and black pepper. It was the same recipe that day as today's. And the same hopelessness in those big brown eyes of hers that could make him speechless with just one look. Granted, he wasn't a man of many words, but being around Lexi had him tongue-tied more than usual. He was 30 years old, but he felt like a teenager discovering women for the first time. Everything about Lexi, from her soft curves that filled out her jeans so well, to the sweet lilt of her voice, made him feel like mush. Like chili that had been simmering for far too long. The photo session, as short as it had been, had just about done him in. The real reason he was glad it was over wasn't because he was camera shy. It was the fear that he wouldn't be able to hide his true feelings for Lexi when she was staring at him non-stop behind her lens. The truth was he'd been in love with her since the first day they met. But he was too much like their foul friend, a chicken, to do anything about it. Stretching out his long legs under the table, he gently nudged her boot with his. "Hey, you can hide out in the kitchen for as long as you like. That way you won't have to cross paths with that two-timing idiot." Lexi's brows shot up before she broke out in a chuckle. "I've never heard such strong words come out of you, James. You always talk like a southern gentleman." He rubbed a hand along the back of his neck. "I just think that any man who would give you up obviously isn't the brightest." "Yeah, well, Thomas is doing awfully well financially, so he can't be that dumb. My mom said he started a company with the money he made from stocks and they just went public." She raked a hand through her short jet black hair, the ends of it curling around her slender neck. With her pink lips twisted to the side, she looked much younger than her age. "I just wish I had something to show for myself, you know? I always imagined the day when I'd see Thomas again, that I'd be more successful, that I'd be able to prove that I'm better off without him. But here I am, living in a place that smells like manure, and I'm as single as a bee trapped in a jar of honey. Not that there's anything wrong with working on a ranch or being single," she rushed on, a line etched between her brows. "I was not thinking about you when I said those things. No offense taken. I know this is a far stretch from where you probably imagined yourself being. That's why most of my relatives moved away from here as soon as they finished school. But you still have a lot of years ahead of you. You don't have to be stuck in Sage Valley forever." He watched her carefully as he spoke his last sentence, wondering how she'd answer. He didn't want to think about the possibility of Lexi leaving. He knew she had only come to Texas as a stopping point while she figured out the next step of her life. "Honestly, I don't feel stuck here. This place has grown on me, cow poo and all. Even Elvis and his crazy attitude is kind of endearing. I can't imagine living anywhere else." He exhaled the breath he'd been holding. "Nana would be relieved to hear that. She's been telling me to find a way to get you to stay here permanently. You've become like an unofficial grandniece to her." "Grandniece? Niece is more like it. Need I remind you that I'm a decade older than you? Age doesn't matter to Nana. To her, you might as well be 14, not 40. Watch it, young man. I'm not 40 yet. 7 more days." She released a soft sigh. "I'd give anything to be 30 again. If only I knew then what I know now." Cocking his head to one side, he eyed her curiously. "What advice would you give to your 30-year-old self, or any 30-year-old? "I'd say time's going to pass you by quicker than you can imagine. Don't be afraid to speak your mind. Try new things. Travel the world. Don't do anything out of fear. Take a chance on what you care about. and no matter how crappy life gets, you'll be okay. Those are some great words of wisdom. Yeah, well, if only I'd put them into practice a decade ago. At least I got to travel after college. But you've done that already. I still can't believe you got to be Backroad Boys' personal chef when they were on tour. That kind of makes you a pop star. He laughed. Not even close. I didn't have girls screaming my name whenever I went out in public. That's probably because you stayed holed up in the kitchen all day long hiding from those girls. Hey, it's where I feel the most at home. You have to agree with me on that. He gave her empty bowl a knowing glance. They don't call it comfort food for nothing. Smirking, Lexi set down her spoon and took a deep breath. Yup. But sooner or later, you have to leave your comfort zone. Which means, as much as I'd like to, I can't hide out here until Thomas and his fiancée leave. It's time to put on my big girl pants and get out there. He nodded. Remember what a wise woman once told me. No matter how crappy life gets, you'll be okay. Touché. Lexi let loose a soft chuckle. Thank you for the chili, James, and thanks for listening. She rose from her seat, gathered up their bowls, and set off toward the kitchen. James watched Lexi leave, replaying her words in his mind. Take a chance on what you care about. Was he ready to follow her advice? All he knew was that he didn't want to be in Lexi's shoes a decade from now wondering if he had missed out on something great. Someone great. But what could he say to her? I love you and think you're the best thing to happen to me since I came back to Sage Valley. I know you had the worst reasons for coming here, but the other guy's loss is my gain. I'm glad that idiot didn't want you because I do. I want to be the one who makes you happy as you are when you eat my chili. I'll cook chili for you every day for the rest of our lives if you'll be mine. What do you say? With a surprising surge of adrenaline rushing through his veins, he hopped up and followed after Lexi. He stepped inside the kitchen as she set the dishes inside the large stainless steel sink. She turned on the tap and began washing a bowl, humming under her breath. If he wasn't mistaken, it was the popular country song Before He Cheats. When he reached her side, he took the soapy bowl from her hands. He nudged her elbow playfully. It might be a bit late for this, but I'm sure I could dig up my old Louisville Slugger if you want to do some damage to Thomas's car. She looked up at him with raised brows. James Scott. When did you start condoning violence? Don't blame me, it's Carrie Underwood's lyrics. He chuckled to see the sparkle return to her eyes. With Lexi standing so close to him, he could smell her sweet honeysuckle perfume. The scent was better than any spice he used in his cooking. I appreciate the thought, James, but friends don't let friends do things they'll regret. This kitchen would fall apart if you got locked up behind bars. And I wouldn't get to eat your amazing chili. That's all I'm good for? My cooking skills? Well, your handsome face isn't bad to look at either, she quipped. But don't let that get to your head. James blinked in surprise. Was Lexi flirting with him? The air in the kitchen suddenly grew thick with anticipation. Any response he wanted to give her got lost en route from his head to his tongue. He only managed a small smile. I won't, he finally replied, turning his attention to the bowl in his hands. The sound of running water filled the awkward silence between them. I'm gonna get back to the store, she said. I'll see you later? Yeah, sure. Call me if you need anything, like more chili. Lexi waved before leaving James alone in the kitchen with his thoughts. Call me if you need more chili. Couldn't he have come up with a better line than that? The only reassurance he had that he hadn't totally messed up was the lingering look Lexi gave him as she left. Maybe she liked him as more than a friend. Or at least more than his chili? Chapter 3. Lexi. Lexi shifted her position on the stool where she sat behind the counter at the ranch's store. Since her arrival at Sage Valley, she'd changed up the gift shop to include a small area for guests to grab a quick bite to eat. She wasn't a chef like James by any means, but she could easily whip up some sandwiches. The last hour had been spent doing just that and making sure there were enough sodas, specifically two Texas favorites, Dr. Pepper and Big Red, in the small fridge. The morning sun streaming in through the side window lit up the laptop screen she'd been staring at. She turned it slightly to get a better look at the photos she'd uploaded a few minutes earlier. Seeing James's face pop up on her screen caused a small flutter in her stomach. Her hand went to her midsection, smoothing down the fabric of her lacy cream blouse that she wore over her favorite pair of jeans. Maybe she was hungrier than she thought. She had skipped breakfast that morning in favor of stocking the store. Part of her argued that she needed to catch up on the work she'd missed yesterday, eating away her woes in bowls of chili. The other, less in denial part of her admitted the real reason she was avoiding the kitchen was because of the awkwardness between her and James. She sighed loudly, the whoosh of air resonating throughout the empty store. What had she done? She'd actually flirted with James yesterday and called him handsome. To his face. It was one thing to think those thoughts, but to say them out loud? She must have really been shaken up by the news of Thomas's arrival to blurt that out loud. And now she'd crossed that fine line between friendship and something more. Her phone dinged with an incoming call. Charlie. If there was anyone who could talk some sense into her, it was her no-nonsense cousin. Lexi turned on the speakerphone. Hey, Char, I'm so glad you called. Hey, Lex, she answered in her sweet southern twang. How are you holding up? Well, considering the fact that I have yet to run into my ex-husband and his new fiancé, but I could at any moment, she gritted her teeth, I've been better. So you're sure he didn't recognize you? Charlie scoffed. I'm not surprised. I can count on one hand the number of times he showed up to our family gatherings when you guys were married. Anyhow, he was too busy talking on the phone. Sounded like work. I mostly chatted with Tiffany. Tiffany, huh? Lexi paused. Even though she really didn't want to know, she had to ask. What's she like? Bubbly. Kinda sweet, actually. I wanted to hate her, but Charlie's voice trailed off. She could picture her cousin twirling a lock of blonde hair around her finger, uncertainty in her blue eyes. It's okay, Char, you don't have to hate her. It's not her fault that Thomas chose her over me. If it wasn't her, it would have been someone else. Someone equally young and pretty and willing to play the part of a doting wife. Yeah, well, you're a much more gracious person than I am. I was ready to put Thomas out to sleep with the cows, literally. Instead, I gave him the farthest cabin from the store. I may have also forgotten to give him a map of the ranch, so he likely won't even know the shop exists, Charlie added with a mischievous tone. Thanks, but I'm pretty sure Tiffany will want to pick up some souvenirs while they're here. It's not that hard to miss the sign over the store that says Sage Valley Ranch Snacks and Snacks. Lexi looked over at the display cases that were filled with bandanas, magnets, and mugs. Visitors to the ranch loved buying anything featuring a Lone Star or an armadillo. Those souvenirs were the perfect symbols of Texas pride. I'll just play it cool when I see them. Maybe I won't even bump into Thomas at all if he's so busy working. I hope that's the case. Hey, Char, there's something else I want to talk to you about. Sure, I'm all ears. What's up? It's about James, Lexi hesitated, wondering if she was making a big deal out of nothing. Is this about the photos you took of him? Sort of, kind of, maybe. She shook her head, then swept away the bangs that fell in her eyes. I need you to talk some sense into me. This sounds interesting, spill it, cuz. What's got you all out of sorts? Yesterday, when I was taking pictures of James, I started to notice things about him that I never saw before. Like how he has this one stubborn lock of hair that always falls onto his forehead when he looks down. There's also the smallest dimple, if you can call it a dimple, that appears when he forces out a smile. And his lips. Lexi stopped herself short as her cheeks started heating. This conversation wasn't helping her at all. She needed to get to the heart of the matter before her thoughts ran wild again. I need you to tell me I'm being ridiculous, that James and I are only friends, and I shouldn't be thinking about his mouth so much. Especially not about how it would feel to kiss it. Groaning, she dropped her head into her hands. Silence came over the line. After a beat, the sound of laughter echoed from the phone. Lexi. You like him? You like James? Lexi turned off the speakerphone and held the phone to her ear. Charlotte Walton. Tell me you didn't just scream that out loud for everyone in the lodge to hear. Don't worry, I'm by myself. No one's here yet. The pounding of her heart eased. Good. The last thing I need is for Nana to get wind of this. Now I need you to tell me this is the craziest thing you've ever heard. What? Why? I think it's fabulous. You and James would make the cutest couple. He's tall, dark, and brooding like a summer thunderstorm. You're short, sweet, and bright like a ray of sunshine. You guys match perfectly. This conversation was not heading in the direction Lexi planned. Charlie, we do not. We're in different life stages. I'm a whole decade older than he is. Whatever I'm feeling isn't realistic. It doesn't make sense. I think it was just the fact that I was staring at him behind the camera lens for so long, my eyes started seeing things. Like how hot he is, Charlie stated with a grin in her voice. I've been wondering how long it would take for you to realize that. Lexi scoffed. But there's plenty of eye candy around here. The ranchers are like walking models out of an issue of Texas Monthly. Sure, but you don't have as close of a friendship with them as you do with James. He's been there for you this whole past year. True. He has been such a good friend to me. He always listened so patiently to her. His friendship sustained her heart as much as his chili fed her stomach. Maybe this is your heart's way of telling you it's ready to move on. To love again. Lexi balked. Love? That's a big word. I don't know, Char. I'm not sure my heart knows what it wants. I was finally happy without a guy for the first time in a long time. Now this? What am I supposed to do with these feelings? You don't think it's hormones, do you? Maybe I'm going through the change. It's hormones all right, but not the kind you're thinking about. Mood swings and hot flashes, that kind of stuff is what our moms are going through. Lexi smirked. You're right about that. Except, I don't think my mom's mood swings can be blamed on menopause. She's been having them all my life. This is more likely my body reacting to her nagging. You're not getting any younger, Alexandra. Both of your older sisters are married with children. What about you? She imitated her mom's nasally voice. I know she's just worried about me, but her calling every day to remind me of how I'm failing at life doesn't help. Well, why don't you do something about it then? You may have fallen off the horse once, but you've done a lot of healing since then. It's time to get back in the saddle and ride again. I'm talking about a different horse though. Do not go back to the one that threw you off. Go get yourself a new, much younger and cuter horse, she added with a giggle. Lexi groaned. That's a terrible analogy, Charlie. What do you expect? We live on a ranch. And on that note, she lowered her voice, I better get to work. There's a guest coming through the door. The front door to the shop opened as well, and an excited female voice filled the air. Mine too. I'll talk to you later, Char, Lexi replied before ending the call. She glanced up to greet her customer and almost dropped her phone. A familiar head of dark brown hair, peppered with gray around the temples, came into view from behind a display case of cowboy hats. The man's chiseled face hovered over his phone as he scrolled down the screen with his index finger. The petite blonde woman who walked beside him wore a white jumpsuit and a pair of 3-inch heels. A swipe of mascara and pink lip gloss completed her look. It wasn't long before she spotted Lexi at the counter and headed her way, pulling the man with her. "Excuse me, miss," she called out as she neared. "I'm looking for a kitchen towel that says Home Sweet Texas. Please tell me you carry some." Lexi swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She nodded and pointed in the direction of the display case to her left. "Right over there." As soon as Lexi spoke up, the man's head jerked up. His green eyes narrowed when they landed on her face. "Lexi? What are you doing here?" "Hey, Thomas." She squeezed out a smile. "Welcome to Sage Valley." Chapter 4. James. James swung his long legs out of his pickup truck and stepped onto the dirt road beside a large grassy field. Behind the wooden fence that surrounded the area, a herd of white and brown spotted cows stood, chewing on their cud. Several young men wearing jeans, boots, and cowboy hats had their hands full administering vaccinations to the cattle. He was delivering lunch to the ranchers today so they wouldn't need to get cleaned up to eat in the mess hall. He walked around to the truck bed and uncovered a large aluminum tray he'd packed up. The deep, rich aroma of ancho chili powder greeted his nose, causing his mouth to water. He was sure this new recipe for pulled pork sandwiches would be a hit. When the thoughts running through his mind prevented him from sleeping last night, he'd spent hours perfecting the barbecue sauce. If only his communication skills were as good as his cooking, he'd know exactly how to speak his heart to Lexi. Lexi. The mere thought of his friend started him blushing. James ran a hand down his face, feeling the prickle of stubble along his jawline. He'd been so distracted this morning, he had forgotten to shave. He probably looked like something a cat dragged in, especially since he'd been raking his hands through his hair all morning. No doubt his good friend and sweet mate, Chris, would notice his condition and start asking questions. Just as he expected, Chris spotted him and immediately strode over. He tipped his Stetson in James's direction before greeting him with a loud whoop. "Hey, James, thanks for bringing lunch out to us." "No problem. How's work going?" "Good." Chris narrowed his eyes under the brim of his hat. "A lot better than you are. What happened to you, man? You look like that raccoon we spotted the other night rummaging through the trash bin behind the mess hall." I was up late testing out this recipe." He avoided Chris's curious hazel eyes. "I'll catch up on sleep tonight." "Okay, if you say so." Turning around, Chris called out to the rest of the crew to come eat. James served up the sandwiches on paper plates and passed them out to the guys as they ambled up. A couple of the men made themselves comfortable sitting on the side of the road, while the rest stood around eating and chatting. Once Chris had gotten his food, he took a couple of steps away from the group and called out to James, "Keep me company, will ya?" After grabbing a piece of cornbread, James followed his friend, coming to a rest near the fence. The two men leaned against the wood and ate in silence. After a few minutes, Chris finally piped up, "You know you gotta tell her how you feel someday." "Huh?" James pretended he didn't know who his friend was referring to, even though they'd had this conversation before. Chris had figured out months ago how James felt toward Lexi, and he hadn't let up on encouraging James to make a move. "Who are you talking about?" "Lexi." "Oh, her." "Oh yes, her. The woman you've been pining over this entire year. I bet she's what kept you up last night. Women have a way of getting to you like an itch you can't scratch." As if proving Chris right, a mosquito flew near James's ear, announcing its presence with a loud buzz. He swatted it away with a scoff. It's like you planned that. I wish I had that much influence. I'd probably have better luck with women." He chuckled. "Why don't you just ask her out?" Trying to stall for time, James chewed his bite of cornbread until it was all but mush. Too bad he didn't have the digestive system of a cow, which required an extra 8 hours of chewing. When he could stall no longer, he finally spat out 2 words, "I can't." "Why not? You're already friends. It's not like she's some girl you met online who ghosted you after 2 messages." "Something which I may or may not have experience with," he added with a smirk. He pursed his lips together, seeming to get lost in his thoughts for a moment. After a second, he blinked and turned to James. "What you have is gold, like a once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. You better do something about it soon, James. Or you'll be stuck in the friend zone and watching the girl you love fall for some big-shot lawyer from the city." James frowned. He knew his friend was still nursing a bruised ego from losing his first love. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Chris uttered a loud shaw and waved his fork around without a care. "It's old news. I'd much rather talk about you. You need to make a move, and you need to do it fast. I heard from Nana the other day that she has her eye on Josiah for Lexi. You know, when Nana gets one of her crazy matchmaking ideas into her head, she runs with it like a horse after a carrot." A chill ran down James's back at the mention of the young bull rider. "Josiah knows nothing about Lexi. He's not the right guy for her." "Exactly." With wide eyes, Chris pointed his fork in James's direction. "But you are. And you need to tell her that before Josiah or anyone else gets to her first." "You're right." James straightened, throwing his shoulders back with determination. His feet started moving as if they had a mind of their own toward the pickup truck. He called over his shoulder to Chris, "I gotta go. Thanks for the talk." Chris saluted him with his fork in hand, a pleased smile spreading across his ruddy face. "Anytime, man." James packed up the food in the back of the truck, then bounded into the front seat. He sped off down the road back to the ranch, a cloud of dirt rising in the rearview mirror. An urgency he couldn't explain rushed through him, growing with each mile as he neared the living quarters. His destination, a small brown building, stood at the end of the row of cabins. When he reached it, he parked and immediately hopped out, the muscles in his neck tightening. Was he really going to do this? If he told Lexi how he truly felt about her, it would turn their relationship upside down. But if he didn't, he'd be stuck in the friend zone like a chicken in its coop, watching her in another man's arms. His jaw clenched at the thought. It was now or never. He rushed toward the store's front door with its sign flipped to open. Through the window, he spotted the back of Lexi's head. Oh, how he longed to take her into his arms, flush against his body. To caress the slender slope of her neck and weave his fingers into her thick black locks. He'd give her a kiss that would make all the cheesy rom-coms she liked to watch pale in comparison. Move over, Hugh Grant and Matthew McConaughey. Those actors had nothing on him. His hand on the knob, James took a last breath before pulling open the door. He stepped inside, and his eyes immediately traveled over a rack of postcards to the counter where Lexi stood. Her pink lips formed an O as she met his gaze. Her eyes lit up with delight and something else, relief, perhaps? Or maybe it was him who felt relieved to see her welcome him so happily. He walked over, ready to pour his heart out, until he noticed someone standing opposite Lexi. The man looked familiar, but James couldn't quite place him. Next to him was a much younger blonde woman. City folks, no doubt. James could spot them and their clean, pressed outfits a mile away. "James," Lexi called out. "There's some people I want you to meet." James reached the couple and dipped his head, touching the brim of his Stetson in greeting. "Hello. I'm James Scott. Welcome to our ranch." "Ooh, a real cowboy." "I can't believe it," the woman squealed as she looked James over from head to toe before offering her hand. "You look like you walked out of one of those westerns." "I'm Tiffany. Could I get your autograph?" He took the woman's hand with a soft chuckle. I'm flattered, miss, but I'm not a movie star. Well, you certainly could be one. She turned to the man beside her who stared at James with much less interest. Don't you think he looks like a young Clint Eastwood, Thomas? Thomas? James's ears perked up. This couldn't be the guy who broke Lexi's heart. He glanced over at Lexi, who gave him a tight-lipped smile. Thomas scoffed. Maybe if you squint. Lexi stepped around the counter and placed a protective hand on James's arm. James has even better skills than acting. He's our head chef. He makes a mean bowl of chile. If you're nice, he might save you one, she added with an overly sweet tone. We'll be nice, Tiffany cooed, oblivious to the tension between the exes. The two of you look so good together. Don't you think so, Thomas? It's great you found love again, Lexi. Lexi's face paled. Oh, James and I, Thomas scoffed, cutting her off. You think they're in love? I would know if Lexi was in love. This is more than likely a rebound relationship. A healthy flush filled Lexi's cheeks. She glanced over at James with a mixture of hurt and desperation on her face. When she turned back to Thomas, she raised her chin with determination. I'll have you know that James and I are very much in love. Aren't we, James? James wouldn't have been more shocked had he been thrown off a horse. Lexi was making this easier than he ever expected. Yes, we are. Chapter 5. Lexi. If there was ever a moment when Lexi wished she were dreaming, this was it. Was it possible that she was still in bed, under her warm covers, and once she opened her eyes, she'd be staring at the wooden ceiling of her bedroom and not at her ex-husband's skeptical face? Ever since he and Tiffany had walked into her shop, she'd been on edge. Thomas hadn't changed at all. If anything, he was more arrogant now than before. Lexi wondered what she'd seen in him and why it had taken her so long to get over him. The only thing she wanted more than anything was to show him she had moved on. Even if it meant lying through her teeth about her current relationship status. Boy, was she in a hot mess. Hotter than a fresh pot of chili. Thomas eyed her and James. So, how long have you two been dating? Not long, but we've been friends since I moved out here. In fact, James is my best friend. We've gotten really close. This much was true. Other than Charlie, she spent the most time with James. She edged closer to him and gave him a grateful smile. She only hoped she wasn't putting their friendship on the line by dragging him into her ruse. That's right, James chimed in. He surprised her by placing his arm around her waist and pulling her to his side. A masculine scent mingled with the delicious smell of kitchen spices filled her senses, making Lexi weak in the knees. She leaned against James, thankful for his firm torso acting as a wall, a very muscular wall. Her stomach dipped to be this close to the man she'd just started falling for. How was she supposed to keep her real emotions out of this now? I know love when I see it. Just like how I knew you were the one for me, Tiffany gushed as she batted her lash extensions at Thomas. Tommy and I met on a singles cruise in Mexico. I was there with my girlfriends, and he was all by his lonesome self, nose buried in his phone. I bought him a fruity drink with one of those cute umbrellas, and we haven't been apart since. She flashed her ring in front of them. We're getting married next spring. We're traveling around the country now looking for the perfect location for a wedding. I love animals, so I thought, what better place than a ranch? Horses, cows, chickens, you've got them all. Am I right? Tiffany's childlike enthusiasm was contagious. Lexi couldn't help but grin right along with her. We've got some stray cats roaming the place, too. I'd warn you to stay away from our rooster, Elvis. He's a bit ornery, but you're so sweet, you'd probably charm his feathers right off. I can see why Thomas fell for you. You are such a sweetie. Tiffany waved her hands in front of her eyes as she sniffled. I knew I'd like you the moment we met. Thomas gave a strained laugh, his eyes flitting from one woman to the other. Sorry to interrupt, but I have a call to make. You coming, darling? Tiffany wrinkled her nose in disappointment. But you promised we'd go horseback riding today. Someone has to make money to pay for this wedding, he retorted as he lowered the sunglasses resting on top of his head to his face. With a smirk, he nodded toward Lexi and James. Good to see you, Lexi. Nice to meet you, Joe. It's James, Lexi called out to Thomas's back as he pushed open the door. Tiffany sighed as she watched Thomas leave. That man works way too much. Sometimes I have to remind him to eat. She paused, her blue eyes widening. Let's have dinner together tonight. Please say yes. It'll be so fun. I love double dating. What do you guys say? Lexi felt James's body stiffen. It was one thing to say they were dating, but another thing to act it out. Having dinner with Tiffany and Thomas would require a whole evening of pretending. I don't think we can, she began with feigned regret. James has to work, and the shop doesn't close until after sundown. Tiffany's face fell. That's all right. I suppose I can bring a book with me to dinner. Thomas gets so occupied with his emails, he's not much for conversation. Oh, Lexi knew her struggle all too well. Communication, or lack thereof, had been an issue for her and Thomas too. Her heart went out to Tiffany, and she found herself making an offer she was sure she'd regret. Maybe we could do a late dinner if that works for you guys. Say 8 o'clock? She turned to James and asked, would that be okay with you? It took an extra beat for James to answer. Sure. We can go to the Cabernet. It's a nice steak place in town about 10 minutes from here. Yes. Beaming, Tiffany jumped in place and clapped her perfectly manicured hands. It's a date. Text us directions, will ya? I'll go tell Thomas now. She grabbed her bag of souvenirs from the counter and waved as she scampered toward the exit. Toodles? Toodles? Lexi shook her head in disbelief when the door closed. What just happened? James raised his brows. I think you agreed to a double date with your ex-husband and his fiancée, he answered with an uneasy tone. At the words double date, Lexi jumped out of James's reach. Her body cooled from the absence of his touch, but her face felt like it was on fire. James. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drag you into this. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop to think about the consequences. Thomas's comment about me being on the rebound just ticked me off. I can't believe he'd say such a thing when he's the one running around with a woman practically half his age. But I shouldn't have involved you, hey? James placed a hand on her back, rubbing comforting circles on it. It's okay, I get it. You wanted to prove a point. I'd do the same thing under the circumstances. You mean to tell me you'd lie and fake a relationship to save your pride? One side of his mouth curved up. Okay, so maybe I wouldn't do the exact same thing. But I wouldn't want someone making assumptions about my friend the way Thomas did about you. I'm glad you put him in his place. Lexi felt her insides melt. If she thought she was falling for James before, she was in over her head now. The way he was holding her gaze, concern darkening his blue eyes, made her heart skip a beat. Thanks for being on my side, James. What I said earlier, I meant it. You really are my best friend. She repeated the sentence in her mind, willing herself to believe it. He was going along with her plan because of their friendship. It was a lot to ask of him, though. Are you sure you're okay with dinner? We could still cancel, it's fine, really. It'll be good to get out. Anyways, friends don't let friends face their exes alone. His words brought a genuine smile to her face. Hey, you're using my line. I hope you don't mind. It's a good one. Of course not. She sighed happily. You're so good to me, James. I owe you one. You don't owe me anything but to have a good evening. We'll make the most of it, all right? He dropped his hand and took a step back. I better go start dinner early, so I have time to wash up before we go. I'll pick you up at 7:15. Sounds good. Lexi nodded and returned to her stool behind the counter. Gratitude washed over her as she watched James walk away with long strides. She suddenly had an urge to do something to thank him. She sprang out of her seat and ran over, grabbing his arm before he pushed open the door. Standing on her tiptoes, she placed a soft kiss on his face. Thank you again, James. James stayed silent, but his cheeks spoke volumes. They resembled two shiny ripe tomatoes ready to be plucked. He ducked his head shyly before mumbling, "It's no problem. I'll, see you later." The door closed behind him, leaving Lexi alone in the store once again. She touched her lips and smiled behind her hand. She had to admit she was looking forward to going on a date with James, even if it was all pretend. Chapter 6. James. James glanced at his reflection in his bathroom mirror and ran his hands through his freshly washed hair. He had about 15 minutes to spare before he needed to pick up Lexi, and he wanted to use his time wisely. It wasn't every day he dressed up for a night on the town, and even less often that he got to bring a date. Date, yeah, right. Maybe in his dreams. He sucked in a breath as he splashed some aftershave on his face, the liquid burning his skin. The cooling sensation served a dual purpose in waking him up to reality. Tonight was not a romantic occasion. He was only going to dinner to help Lexi out. There was nothing going on between them. As much as he wanted to believe the kiss she had given him meant more than friendship, he doubted she felt the same. He recalled how she had stepped away from his touch as soon as Tiffany left the store. She had only needed him to play a part. Without an audience watching, he remained a friend. Her best friend, but still only a friend. A knock on the door pulled James out of his thoughts. He opened it and found Chris on the other side, grinning like a fool. "Hey, man, thanks for lending me your coat." He reached out to grab Chris's tuxedo-style black sports coat that he planned to wear with his nicest pair of blue jeans and black boots. "I'll return it to you tomorrow." Hoping to escape his friend's inquisition, he hurriedly closed the door, only to have Chris stick his boot in the doorway. "Not so fast, mister." Chris nudged the door open, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "All you said over the phone was that you're going to town for dinner. Spill it. I want details. Who are you getting dressed up for?" James groaned, walking past Chris to get to the end of the hall. He stepped inside his room, which suddenly felt crowded with his queen-sized bed, a dresser, and the presence of another 6-foot man. Or maybe it was the intensity in his friend's eyes that made him feel like there wasn't enough air in the room. He knew he'd never get any peace if he didn't provide the answers Chris wanted. Sighing, James laid the coat on the bed and crossed his arms over his chest. The fabric of his white button-down shirt stretched across his upper arms, squeezing his biceps. The tightness was nothing compared to the constricted feeling in his chest at being put on the spot. "If you must know, I'm going with Lexi." Chris slapped his thigh. "I knew it. You got up the nerve to ask her out. I'm proud of you, man, not so fast." "It's not what you think," James confessed. He grimaced, certain he'd get an earful from Chris once the truth came out. "Lexi and I are only pretending to date, so her ex, Thomas, thinks she's moved on. We're meeting up with Thomas and his new fiancée." It took Chris a full 5 seconds to pick up his jaw. "Say what? Whose bright idea was this? Because let me tell you, it's a horrible one. You can't be going on a fake date with the woman you like." "I hadn't planned for this to happen. I was going to ask her out for real, but her ex was at the shop, and one thing led to another," James shrugged helplessly. "I think this could work in my favor though. Lexi will see how good we are together, and when I ask her out for real, she'll have to say yes." Eyeing James dubiously, Chris placed his hands on his hips and sighed. I don't know about that. This is an awfully strange way to start a relationship. Why don't you just come clean to Lexi and tell her how you feel? Then the both of you can actually enjoy a real date tonight. James hesitated. A part of him knew very well why he wasn't going to confess his feelings, at least not yet. It was easier to play pretend where there was no risk of rejection. It's better this way. She's already on edge with Thomas around. I don't want to stir things up even more. You know what, man? You're pulling an Elvis. Chris brought his hands to his armpits and began flapping his arms like a bird. He added a few cock-a-doodle-doos for emphasis. You're too chicken to tell Lexi. Tell me what? The sweet feminine voice calling out from the doorway made both men turn around. It wasn't uncommon for Lexi to stop by their two-bedroom suite unannounced, but James wasn't in the mood for surprises today. His mouth grew as dry as if he'd just chewed on a handful of saltines. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Lexi as she walked over, looking breathtakingly gorgeous in a dark red dress under a black wrap. The lacy fabric hugged her curves and flared out at her hips, giving James a good eyeful of her shapely legs that ended in a pair of brown and turquoise boots. She wore more makeup than usual, with glittery eyeshadow and her lips painted a bright red shade. A pair of long dangling silver and turquoise earrings in the shape of feathers swung about her dark hair that framed her face in soft waves. Lexi's sweet floral perfume gave James a heady sensation as she neared, her brow quirked curiously. It took him a moment to realize she was waiting for an answer, but he couldn't remember what the question was. Huh? What are you too chicken to tell me? A smile played on her lips, mesmerizing him with their fullness. He drew a blank and stood there looking like a fool. What the secret ingredient in his chili is, Chris piped up as he gave James a hearty slap on the back. Yep, our boy James here is afraid you'll be shocked to learn what he uses. It's such a secret, even I don't know what it is, and I know everything there is to know about him, including the type of woman he likes. James spluttered, suddenly consumed by a coughing fit. He had been playing it cool, making a mental note to thank Chris later for coming to his rescue. That was until he heard Chris's last line. He shot his friend a wide-eyed look, feeling his face heat up. Great. If Lexi hadn't been suspicious before, she sure was now. He caught his breath and smiled nervously at Lexi. What are you doing here? I was going to pick you up. I was ready early, so I thought I'd save you the trip. Lexi glanced from James to Chris and back again. She shook her head with a chuckle. I get the feeling I missed out on something good. No, nothing at all. James grabbed the sports coat off the bed and nodded toward the door. Ready to go? Sure, Lexi answered. The sooner we get to the restaurant, the sooner we can get this double date over with. James stepped aside to allow Lexi and Chris to exit the room. He followed and closed his bedroom door behind him. Chris waved as James and Lexi headed outside. If I were you, Lexi, I'd work on getting that secret out of James tonight. It's a good one. Have fun, y'all. James bit back the choice words he had for his friend as he led Lexi in the direction of his truck. Don't mind him. He likely had one too many slices of pie tonight. Amusement flickered across Lexi's face. I must admit I'm curious about this secret ingredient. Are you sure you can't give me a hint? Sorry. He shook his head regretfully. It's a recipe passed down through the generations. You have to be family to know the details. But I'm your girlfriend, she remarked, batting her lashes at him. That's gotta count for something. For a second, James wondered if Lexi was serious. Maybe they were doing more than acting tonight. All too soon, however, she cracked a smile and nudged him playfully with her elbow. I'm kidding, James. We're pretending, remember? His stomach dropped in disappointment. Of course they were. How would he ever convince Lexi to see him as more than a friend? Chapter 7. Lexi. Lexi found it hard to focus on her pan-seared scallops when all she wanted to do was stare at the gorgeous man beside her. James cleaned up well, oh so well. He looked dashing in a crisp white shirt that seemed to fit his torso like a second skin. He might not work out on the field daily, but his build resembled that of a rancher, toned and muscular. Besides his appearance, James was a cowboy through and through. As a Southern gentleman, he opened doors for her and ensured she was comfortable in their booth at the back of the restaurant. This was actually her first time at the Cabernet. She and Charlie came to town on occasion, but they usually grabbed a bite to eat at a casual cafe. There was also a dance hall called the Two-Step that some of the ranch employees liked to frequent on the weekends. This place was much more high-end but with a Western appeal. The neutral color scheme of brown, gray, and dark navy complemented the large black and white photographs of cattle hanging on the wall. The dim lighting made for a romantic space, along with the peace and quiet of a Tuesday evening. James ate his meal with great interest, savoring every bite. She could tell from the half-grin on his face that he was pleased with his prime rib. Seeing him enjoy his dinner made her appetite return. The flutters that had occupied her stomach since she first saw James tonight disappeared. Lexi relaxed, reminding herself to appear happy and in love. Not that it was hard to do. Being near James filled her heart with more joy and contentment than she'd known in all her years of marriage. Her ex-husband was the polar opposite of James. Across the table, Thomas chewed on his steak mindlessly, glancing at his watch now and then. He had always checked his email during meals when they were married, eager to finish eating so he could get back to work. Dressed in a gray suit and tie, he sat stiff and straight in his seat. Tiffany, on the other hand, was all smiles in a magenta dress with her hair bouncing around her shoulders as she chattered. She tried to include Thomas in their conversation about the latest reality show she was binge-watching, but with little success. Lexi couldn't help feeling bad for her. During a lull in the conversation toward the end of the meal, Lexi directed a question at Thomas, knowing the topic would interest him. "How's work treating you these days? I heard from my mom that you started your own company." Thomas's eyes suddenly lit up. "She told you about it?" She did sound really proud on the phone. "It's going well, thanks for asking. We actually exceeded last quarter's projected earnings. At this rate, I can retire early." Tiffany clapped her hands. "Thomas wants to take me around the world. I have so many items on my bucket list. Australia, Fiji, the Bahamas. Most of all, I want to see the Northern Lights." Lexi blinked quickly. This was news to her. Thomas had never made travel, something she loved, a priority. He'd actually encouraged her to give up her job as a flight attendant when they got married. "That's a surprise. I didn't think you liked traveling." "I didn't," Thomas smirked, "but I'm open to it now. The older I get, the more I want to experience. I bet you feel the same. Turning 40 makes you reevaluate life." "You're 40, Lexi?" Tiffany gasped. I figured you were around Thomas's age, but I didn't think you were." Her eyes widened in chagrin. You don't look it at all." "She's not quite there yet," James jumped in. "But you're right. Lexi's got an endless supply of energy. Sometimes she makes me tired. There's so much life in her. She can brighten the room with just one smile." Lexi's stomach dipped under James's attentive gaze. The sincerity in his blue eyes both touched and confused her. She'd never heard him talk this way before. Was James just putting on a show for their guests? "That's really sweet of you to say." James flashed Lexi his signature smile. "It's the truth. So, how did you get Lexi to go out with you?" Tiffany's eyes grew wide with interest. "And did you guys kiss on the first date?" "Oh my goodness, this is just like an episode of the Men Tell All like they have for The Bachelorette, except there's only one man, you know what I mean." So tell us all the juicy deets. Well, it was pretty straight to the point. Rubbing his chin, James spoke thoughtfully. I'm not much for talking, so I sent Lexi a text. Asked if she'd wanted to go line dancing. The rest was history. Line dancing. That's so cute. Thomas shot down Tiffany's hopeful smile with a firm shake of his head. I'm not dancing in any line. What about at our wedding? Can't you just picture it? The wedding party could dance together with us. Thomas answered her with a roll of his eyes. Lexi released the breath she'd been holding. Maybe Tiffany would be so caught up in thoughts of dancing, she'd forget her earlier question about the kiss. Because it was not a good idea to think about placing her mouth on James's, not when all she wanted to do was lean over and close the gap between, fine, no dancing. Tiffany obliged with a pout. She sighed dramatically, then suddenly brightened. So, how about the kiss? Was it all fireworks and stars? Or more of a slow burn? I love slow burn kisses. They're so romantic and melty. Melty? Lexi's heart rate picked up speed as she tried to think of ways to stall. Is that a real word? James nodded. It's more of a casual term used to describe food. Like you put cheese under a grill until it's bubbling and melty. It also works with love, too. You can say just one look into his eyes makes me all melty. Tiffany squealed in delight. Is that what happened when James kissed you for the first time, Lexi? Lexi forced out a laugh. What? Oh yeah, definitely. How can anyone resist those gorgeous baby blues? Tiffany nudged Thomas and remarked happily, see, I told you they're the real deal. Oh, we are, Lexi agreed enthusiastically, trying to keep her breathing even. Just a little while longer and they'd be done with this ruse. They'd be home free, a thought which both brought relief and disappointment. She was actually starting to feel comfortable with their role-playing. Well, now that we've got that established, Thomas announced, it's time to call it a night. I have more work to catch up on before tomorrow. He motioned with one hand for the check, which a server promptly brought over. My treat. To celebrate your new relationship, he added as he plopped down a handful of bills. He stood up promptly and motioned for Tiffany to follow. Thank you for dinner. James stood up briefly to shake Thomas's hand. Tiffany blew them a kiss as she trailed after Thomas in her stilettos. See you guys later. Bye. Lexi called out with a wave. When they were out of sight, she slumped against the booth and burst out with a shaky laugh. They had not only survived the double date, they had also convinced Thomas and Tiffany they were a couple. Thank you so much, James. You did it. You were amazing coming up with that story. It wasn't so hard. That was the first time we hung out, remember? Of course I remember. I didn't know it was possible to step on someone's toes while line dancing, she teased him. Hey, I have bigger feet than you. James pretended to pout. Good thing she didn't ask for more deets, he chuckled, about the kiss. That would have been harder to make up. I bet you could have come up with something. He gave her an uneasy smile, then nodded toward the exit. You about ready to head out too? Okay. Lexi gathered her purse and wrap and followed James to the door. She had to force her feet to move, one step in front of the other. As much as she'd dreaded the double date, she wasn't ready to end their charade. She wished the evening could go on forever, because honestly, she loved how easy it was to role-play boyfriend and girlfriend with James. It seemed James might have felt the same way because he turned to her with a grin and asked, Want to go visit your hooved friends? Lexi couldn't stop the smile spreading across her face. Sure. Their fake date might be over, but maybe a real one was about to start? Chapter 8. James. James drove them back to the ranch, his mind spinning at the possibilities that lay before them for the rest of the evening. He hadn't wanted their date, or pseudo-date, to end yet, so he'd come up with the best reason to extend their time together, the horses. Since the day Lexi had met her first horse at Sage Valley, she had fallen in love. The horses, Tabasco, Sweet Pea, Shiloh, and Shadow, loved her back just as much. She spent much of her first few weeks on the ranch in their company, whispering to them as if they were close friends. What she said, he didn't have a clue, but he figured the one-sided conversations had something to do with her heartaches. Over the months, the amount of time Lexi spent in the barn decreased, especially after she started spending more time with him. James knew though that she'd appreciate catching up with them tonight. After they parked, they walked over to the stable. The moonlight shone down, casting a yellow glow on the large wooden building. All was quiet on the ranch at this time of the evening, except for the clamor of crickets chirping in the distance. And the pounding of James's heart in his chest. He took a deep breath to calm himself, inhaling the warm air. He was starting to feel nervous being near Lexi, which was odd, considering how comfortable he usually felt around her. But that was before he considered revealing his feelings. Now that they were alone, could he? Should he? His steps slowed as he got lost in his thoughts. Lexi, on the other hand, picked up her pace as she neared the stable doors. She stepped inside, and James quickly followed. The scent of sweet hay mixed with a dusty, musky smell engulfed them. It was the fragrance of his childhood, completely familiar and almost as comforting as the smell of spices. He loved that Lexi, a self-proclaimed beach bum, found the smell of the country endearing too. That had been one of the reasons he'd fallen for her so effortlessly. Despite their backgrounds and age difference, they had such similar likes and interests. James watched as Lexi stopped at a stall belonging to a chestnut horse. Shiloh turned toward Lexi and whinnied in delight. When Lexi gently touched his face, he gave her hand a nudge. "Sorry, sweetheart. I don't have any carrots or apples for you today. We just came by to say hi. I promise to bring you something next time, okay?" Lexi stated in a kind tone as she gazed adoringly into the horse's big brown eyes. She turned toward James and cocked her head with amusement. Earth to James. "Come in, please." Huh? James didn't realize he'd been staring at Lexi, mesmerized. The sight of her in that red dress, talking to a horse, made his heart do flip-flops in his chest. It was a strange way to describe the joy coursing through his body, but that was how it felt. Without meaning to, he murmured his thoughts out loud. "You're so beautiful." Lexi's head jerked up. "What did you say?" His voice trailed off as he walked toward her. With his long legs, he bridged the distance between them in 2 steps, coming face to face with Lexi. He took a shaky breath. It was now or never. He needed to say it again. "I said you look beautiful." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. After the surprise wore off, Lexi bit her bottom lip and smiled shyly. "Thanks. You look pretty great yourself, too. I'd been meaning to tell you all night, but there wasn't a good time." "Well, now that we're alone, it's as good a time as any, I suppose." He stared at Lexi like a fool, wishing he could say everything on his mind, but it had suddenly drawn a blank. It was as bland as a pot of water. Where were all the compliments he wanted to give her and the promises he longed to make? He shook his head, hoping the motion would make the words fall into place and out of his mouth. "I had a really good time tonight. How about you?" "I did too. Not the whole eating with my ex and his fiancée part of it, but definitely the having you by my side bit." "Yeah, that was nice." She paused and chuckled softly. "You know something? It felt so natural, didn't it? Our fake relationship, I mean." Her words hung between them, more startling than the smell of horse sweat. She was practically giving him the perfect opening. James gave himself a virtual kick in the rear. "Well, I didn't have to act much. It kind of came naturally." "Did it?" Lexi's voice was breathless as she studied his face. You never told me you studied acting. I didn't. So, she began inching toward him with every word. If you weren't acting, James, what were you doing? The sweet, almost flirtatious smile playing on Lexi's lips made his whole body warm. Another step closer and she'd be flush against him. In fact, they were close enough that he could smell the floral fragrance of her shampoo as she tilted her head up. The heady scent nearly made him forget his train of thought until, they both turned to see Shiloh leaning over the stall, literally poking his nose into their business. He blew a puff of air out of his nostrils, then wedged himself in between James and Lexi. If James didn't know better, he'd think the horse was jealous. As much as he liked the animal, he almost laughed in his face. I don't think he likes us being this close. Apparently not. Oh, sweetheart, Lexi cooed as she stroked Shiloh's nose, you don't have to worry. You'll always be the first guy who won my heart here in Sage Valley. You hear that, boy? James chimed in. You're the man, I mean, the horse. He chuckled and shook his head. This is wild. I never thought there'd be competition from a horse. Lexi quirked a brow, her eyes bright. Competition? For what? So much for stalling. James knew he'd regret it if he didn't say something now. But just when he was about to open his mouth, his cell phone rang. He plucked it out of his back pocket, intending to silence it, until he saw the name lighting up the screen. With an apologetic smile, he mouthed, sorry, and proceeded to answer the call. James, man, how are you? The smooth tenor voice of Backroad Boys frontman, Nick, came over the line. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. It was the worst, but James couldn't tell his former employer that. No, it's fine. What's going on? I thought you guys were vacationing in the Bahamas. We are, and we were having a great time until the guy we hired after you just quit on us claims he met the love of his life on the beach. He's staying here to be with her, which means we need you, he bellowed the word, to come back. Wait, you want me to go on tour again? He saw Lexi's brows shoot up as soon as the words left his mouth. A pained look creased her beautiful features. She leaned her weight against the stall and dropped her eyes. Yep. Nick exclaimed in James's ear. It's just for the spring, maybe the summer too. Just long enough so we can find someone who cooks as amazing as you do. What do you say? I don't know. As much as he had enjoyed traveling with the band, he couldn't bear the thought of not seeing Lexi every day. And there were Nana and Bucky to consider too. Summer's the busiest season at the ranch. My great-aunt and uncle need me, we'll pay you double. James's jaw dropped. Double? You already paid me more than enough. You and that chili of yours are worth every penny. Say you'll think about it. The sound of several females screaming in the background resounded through the phone, followed by the splash of water. We leave on tour in a week. Text me your decision this weekend. I gotta go. The pool's calling my name. James heard silence on the other end and returned the phone to his pocket. Oh, how he wished he hadn't taken that call. Not only had it interrupted a potentially great moment, it also complicated matters a lot. Releasing a deep breath, he slowly met Lexi's gaze. That was, Nick from Backroad Boys. She nodded. I figured that much. They lost their chef, so he offered me my old job back until they find someone new. Sounds like he gave you a great offer. She squeezed out a smile. When would you start? 1 week. Lexi stood up straight and crossed her arms against her chest, a resolute look on her face. You should take it, James. Go travel and have fun. You're only young once. But what about the kitchen? I can't leave them on such short notice. They can handle things for a little while. If needed, Charlie can call in some of the temporary staff to help out. James frowned. If he didn't know better, he'd think Lexi wanted him to go. What about the conversation they were about to have? Did their relationship not matter to her? But, the ranch is my home. My family and friends are here. You're here, he wanted to add but couldn't. The moment they had shared had already passed. Instead, he added in a hopeful tone, "What about my chili?" She shrugged nonchalantly. "It's just chili. There's plenty of other food to eat." His heart sank. She might as well have said there were plenty of other fish in the sea because he felt as insignificant as a sardine. He made up his mind to keep his mouth shut. So much for wanting to share his true feelings with Lexi. Chapter 9. Lexi. Lexi took a sip from the mug Charlie handed her, hoping the coffee would do its trick. She hadn't been sleeping well the past few days, ever since James had told her about his job offer with the band. Of course she didn't want to see him go, but what else could she do? Telling him how she felt would only make him stay. What if he regretted that decision? As his friend, she wanted the best for him. In this case, the best was telling him to take the job and avoiding him whenever possible. The less she saw of James, the less likely she'd entertain any thoughts of a future with him, right? With careful planning, she had steered clear of the kitchen and the mess hall. Instead, she'd been eating cereal and sandwiches from the store. Her strategy seemed to be working because she'd avoided plenty of folks in the last few days, including Thomas and Tiffany, who had left for California yesterday. She'd only seen James in passing, but she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. "You shot yourself in the foot, cuz." Charlie gave her a pointed look. She leaned against her desk in the lodge where the two of them were having a heart-to-heart early Friday morning. "James was about to spill his guts to you, and you told him to leave. You don't know for sure what he was going to say. He could have meant Shiloh was competing with him for my attention, nothing more. Lexi, come on. He wants your attention, your heart, and, quite possibly, your hand." But before he could tell you any of that, you told him to take the job. Why? Because he's young. He should be out there enjoying life and seeing the world, not trapped here with an old maid like me. Lexi blew at her coffee, watching small ripples form in the dark liquid. "I just want him to be happy, to not have any regrets in life. I want the best for him." Charlie narrowed her eyes. "Bless your heart, Lexi Turner. Do you really think he'd rather be thousands of miles away traveling with a bunch of guys instead of here at home with you? Maybe, maybe not. But his 40-year-old self will be happy that he did. And you know this because your almost 40-year-old self is telling you so?" Charlie scoffed. "You know, for someone who's 7 years older than me, you're not much wiser." Lexi almost spit out her mouthful of coffee. Her cousin might be direct, but she usually spoke her words in a joking manner. There was no humor in her tone now. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I'm doing what's right for James. I know you have good intentions and you want what's best for him, but that's your problem. What about you? You spent the last decade of your life thinking about what Thomas wanted, you hardly thought about yourself. What do you want?" Lowering her gaze, Lexi pulled at a loose thread on her blue top. The color reminded her of James's vivid eyes and how they lit up whenever he looked her way. She couldn't believe how close they had come to sharing a moment the other evening in the stable. A moment that would have shifted their friendship in the most wonderful way. She was sure he felt the same for her as she did for him. If only they had gotten the chance to say so. She raised her eyes, meeting Charlie's concerned ones. Lexi knew her cousin was speaking from her heart. If the tables were turned, she would be just as concerned. But she'd never been good at listening to herself about what she wanted. As a young girl, she'd been trained to do as her mom wanted. As a young woman, she had done everything to support her husband. Now, 3 days from her birthday, she finally had the chance to think for herself. What did she want? Lexi said the words that had been weighing on her heart the past week: "I want to be with James." Yes. Charlie held her hand out for a high five. That's what I've been waiting to hear. You need to go tell him. Now? Actually, yesterday would have been preferable, but yes, now. What are you waiting for? Charlie took the mug from Lexi's hands and set it on the desk. With a wave of her hand, she sent her out the door. Go, girl, go. Taking quick steps, Lexi walked into the bright sunshine that shone down from a sky of puffy clouds. She set out toward the ranch's kitchen, with determination and excitement propelling her steps. Her boots kicked up dust along the dirt path. A few feet away, a loud cluck caught her attention. Oh, it was her favorite rooster, no doubt coming to stir up trouble. Elvis strutted by and halted in front of her, the red comb on his head acting as a stop sign. Lexi placed her hands on her hips and stood firmly rooted in place. Out of my way, Elvis, she chided him. If you can't tell, I'm on a mission. You of all people, I mean, birds, should understand. I'm on my way to see a hunk of burning love. Now, don't be cruel and let me pass. Please. To Lexi's surprise, the rooster crowed once then flapped his wings. His head jerked forward and back as he strode past Lexi without so much as a look back. Wow, that was easy, she murmured under her breath. She grinned, feeling more optimistic than ever. Even Elvis had given her his blessing. There was nothing that could stop her now. She picked up her pace with each step forward, reaching the building in record time. The savory scents of cumin and oregano enveloped her as soon as she opened the door to the mess hall. Chili. Oh, how she'd missed James's cooking. Her mouth watering, she followed the aroma like a rat under the Pied Piper's spell. She peeked through the open kitchen door and immediately spotted James at the stove. She didn't need her camera lens to see how handsome James was. His broad shoulders filled out his jean shirt well as he stood tall and confident in his regular pair of cowboy boots. She recognized the thoughtful expression on his face when he tasted a bite from the large pot before him. He nodded his approval after a few seconds and turned the fire to low. Lexi realized she was wasting time gawking at him, so she took a step inside. Clearing her throat, she waited for him to turn around. When he did, she greeted him with her brightest smile. Hey, stranger. Lexi, hi. He cocked his head in confusion. I thought you said you were busy doing inventory this week. I got unbusy. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Why were her palms sweaty? This was her best friend, for crying out loud. She could talk to him about almost anything. Hopefully that would include her feelings for him. Do you have a minute? Yeah. He nodded toward the pot on the stove. Would you like a bowl? Of course. You don't even have to ask. He ladled some chili into a bowl and handed it to her, along with a metal spoon. He gestured for her to take a seat at the counter across from where he stood. I'm actually glad you stopped by. I wanted to talk to you about something. Her mouth full of chili, she nodded for him to go on. James cleared his throat, an uneasy look crossing his face. Leaning his elbows on the counter, he clasped his large hands together. I took your advice. Advice? What advice? The chef job. I decided to take it. Lexi's body grew cold despite the hot bowl in her hands. James was leaving to go on tour? This was not how she expected this conversation to go. I see. How long will you be gone for? 1 month minimum, 6 at the most. She dropped her gaze, not wanting James to see her eyes water. Her appetite suddenly vanished. Instead, a heaviness gnawed at her heart. What did Nana and Bucky say? They don't know yet. I'm going to tell them tonight. Lexi dragged her spoon back and forth in her bowl, drawing circles and zigzags through the dark liquid. You're not saying anything. Do you not like the chili today? No, it's good. She quickly blinked back her tears, thinking about how different it'll be to not have you around. Hey, I'll be back before you know it. Sage Valley is my home. Nothing could keep me away, especially when my friends and family are here. James surprised her by reaching across the counter. Lexi watched her hand disappear in his, the strength of his fingers offering her some much-needed comfort. She raised her head. When their gazes met, a bolt of electricity seemed to pass between them. There was so much she wanted to say, but the words lay still on the tip of her tongue. She merely nodded, relishing in the warmth of his touch. All too soon, he pulled his hand back. What is it you stopped by for? Was there something you wanted to talk about? Oh, no, nothing, she answered casually. I just came by to say hi. And for some of your chili. Her spoon made a dinging sound as she tapped it on the edge of her bowl. Which I'm really going to miss when you're gone. I thought you said it was just chili. Her cheeks warmed to have gotten caught in a fib. I guess the thought of you actually not being around to make it is starting to sink in. It's not just chili. It's my comfort food. And you're my comfort person, she added to herself. The thought of not having either James or his chili around made her sigh. Tell you what, I'll give you the recipe so you can make it whenever you want. Her brows shot up. Including the secret ingredient? Unfortunately, that's the one thing I can't reveal. He held up his palms in a gesture of peace. I told my Grams I'd keep it in the family. I'm a man of my word. Of course. Friends don't let friends break promises. Thanks for understanding, Lex. He ran a hand through his sandy hair before continuing. We'll be sure to celebrate your birthday before I go. We don't have to. It's not a big deal. It's a big deal to me. Anyhow, I have a whole day planned already. I'll ask Nana for the day off for both of us. I'm sure she'll say yes. Lexi nodded, returning James's sweet smile. He might be leaving soon, but she still had time to spend with him. That, at least, was something worth looking forward to. Chapter 10. James. James sat at his great-aunt and great-uncle's table, the square one by the kitchen window where he used to eat during his summer visits as a child. The wooden chair once enveloped him with its size, but now it barely fit his large frame. Times had changed, and so had he. He'd been somewhat of a lone star in his youth, studious and socially awkward. These days he was more comfortable in social settings and even had a female best friend. The friendship was great, but he longed for more with Lexi, so much more. What he wouldn't give to hold her in his arms and finally tell her how he felt. He might look like a grown man, but sometimes he still felt like an awkward, gangly preteen. That was exactly how he felt earlier today when Lexi stopped by the kitchen. The words just wouldn't come, which was why he'd resorted to speaking through his actions. He hoped that simple touch of his hand told her he'd always be there for her, even if the timing wasn't right. Because the timing couldn't have been more off. Nana plunked down a steaming bowl of chicken and dumplings before James and joined him at the table for his late-night dinner. She wiped her hands on her red apron that she wore over a checkered shirt and jeans. If it weren't for her salt and pepper hair, she could easily blend in with women half her age, especially with her wit and energy. Come on now, boy, she clucked, worry lines etched across her forehead. Why the long face? Eat up and tell me all your woes. There's nothing that some good southern cooking and a wise old woman can't cure. That's precisely why I'm such a happy old man, James, Bucky piped up from the next room where he was reading the paper. Don't forget well fed. Nana called back, earning her a soft chuckle from her husband. James couldn't help smiling at their banter. That's what he enjoyed about visiting the Buchanans, seeing their affection for each other after all these years. Despite their busy lives of raising twin daughters and managing the ranch, they kept their love alive. He could sure learn some pointers about relationships from them. But first, he needed to address his work situation. I hate to do this to y'all, but I've gotten a job offer from my old boss. The good news is that it's only a temporary position, but I will need to be gone from the ranch for at least a month. Nana's cheeks pinked as she pursed her lips. Well, that's surprising news. I suppose it makes sense, given your age. Why does my age matter? Lexi mentioned that too when I told her. A twinkle lit up the older woman's eyes. Did she now? What exactly did she say? Something about me being young and needing to explore the world and not having any regrets. And what did you say? That I'd rather stay here in Sage Valley. My home is here. The folks I care about are here. Nana narrowed her eyes at him. So tell me, why are you taking this offer if you'd rather not go? It pays well. I'd like to save up some money so I can support a family someday. Other than that, there's not much that draws me to the job. Tell me more about this family. Is there someone specific you have in mind to start such a family with? Nana's tone was casual, but there was a sly smile on her face. Maybe, James admitted shyly. And have you told this woman how you feel? I tried, but we got interrupted. I'm hoping though that maybe the time apart will help her realize, never mind. He quickly stuffed a dumpling in his mouth. His statement already sounded foolish in his mind. He could only imagine what Nana would think if he spoke it out loud. Keeping his mouth busy was a better way to go. Help her realize what, James? That you like her, and that's the reason why you're leaving to go work someplace else? He gulped, not missing how illogical her statement was. Not exactly. More along the lines of helping her realize how much she'll miss me when I'm gone. Yep, it did sound as stupid as he thought it would. Nana chuckled softly. Well now, that is one way to go about things. The other, more effective way, however, to winning a woman's heart is to tell her exactly how you feel. That you don't want to leave her, but you're doing it for your future, for both of your futures. She gave him a pointed look. Now that's the way to win Lexi over. James almost spit out his food. He loosened his collar with one finger, stretching out the cotton fabric to bring relief to his warm neck. Who said anything about Lexi? I may be getting old, James Scott, but I'm hardly blind or deaf, yet. She sure ain't, Bucky agreed from the other room. Nana rolled her eyes. I've seen the way you look at her, like she's the best thing since the Instant Pot was invented. That's why I asked her to take your photos. So she'd get a good look at you and realize what a catch you are, she added with a wink. He laughed uncomfortably. Who knew Nana had been playing matchmaker? I appreciate your efforts, Nana, really I do, but I'm afraid it didn't work. Didn't work? Boy, what I did wasn't magic. You still need to do your part. I gave you an opening. Now you need to convince her you're the man for her. Unless you want someone else, like a certain Josiah, to sweep her off her feet while you're gone? The mere mention of the young bull rider made James's shoulders tense. Do you really think he's interested in Lexi? You never know. She's a beautiful, smart woman. I'm sure plenty of the male staff think she's a good catch. The word plenty sent adrenaline pumping through James's body. Why did he make the decision to leave? But even if he told Lexi how he felt before he went on tour, would she want to wait for him? I regret taking that job now. Nana reached over to pat his arm. Well, there's no time for regrets, James. You just need to make the most of your time before you go. By the way, when are you planning on leaving us? Next Tuesday. Don't worry, I've prepped the kitchen staff already on what needs to be done. And Charlie said she can hire a temp worker to come in on the weekends if needed. Good on you for taking care of everything already. Everything except the most important thing, she added with a knowing smile. You promise me you'll talk to Lexi before you go, you hear? That's the other matter I wanted to ask you about. I'd like to take her out for her birthday next Monday. Nana beamed, the laugh lines around her eyes deepening. Now that's a plan I can get behind. I'll cover for her in the shop. I hope you have something romantic in mind. Something to sweep Lexi off her feet and right into your arms. She means literally, boy, Bucky called out. Your aunt used to love it when I picked her up, before my back gave out. Why is it that man can hear our whole conversation, yet he doesn't hear me when I ask him to pick his socks up off the floor, she muttered in dismay. Bucky chuckled, his loud laughter traveling from the next room. My hearing aid must have been off those times, sweetheart, or maybe the battery's old. Old battery, my foot, Nana scoffed with a playful shake of her head. It's a good thing I love him. James grinned. I hope to have something as special as you and Bucky have one day. You will, James, you will. Anyone who cooks well, loves well. Take it from me, a wise old woman who taught you most everything you know about food. You did, Nana. James smiled. Thanks for the delicious meal and the pep talk, too. James left the Buchanan's place feeling more full and hopeful than when he'd arrived. He now just needed to come up with a plan to make Lexi's 40th birthday memorable and secure her heart before he left. Chapter 11. Lexi. Lexi's jaw dropped as soon as she opened the door to her cabin early Sunday morning. She blinked quickly, not knowing if her sleep-deprived eyes were seeing things. Once. Twice. After the third blink, and a loud sigh from the petite Asian woman standing on her porch, she swallowed hard. There was no denying reality. Her mother had shown up unannounced in Sage Valley. Ming-ju. I have been standing out here in this heat for nearly a minute. This dust is terrible for my skin. Please let me in. I need to moisturize. Ma? Lexi stuttered, closing the door behind her. It was never a good thing when her mom used her Chinese name. What are you doing here? Mrs. Turner charged past Lexi, dragging a large suitcase in tow. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her perfectly oval face wore a look of determination. I am paying you a visit. It has come to my attention that you have been keeping secrets from me. I cannot believe that after all I have done for you, you would keep me in the dark like this. I don't know what you're talking about, Ma. I don't have any secrets. Lexi crossed her arms over her pajama top as she followed her mother down the hall to the bathroom. She cringed, knowing the inevitable lecture she'd receive when her mother saw the changes she'd made to the decor since her last visit almost a year ago. Before you go in there, you should know, yeah. Mrs. Turner exclaimed, clucking her tongue. Why is the door open? And the toilet seat not closed? Where is the wind chime and blue rug I bought you? You are flushing away all the positive energy. Ma, you know I don't believe in feng shui. Lexi rushed in after her mom, picked up some clothes from the floor, and tossed them into a straw hamper. She glanced around the small space, doing a mental inventory of anything else that needed tidying. I wish you'd told me you were coming. I could have cleaned up. Her mother took a small bottle of lotion from her purse and applied a few dabs of the white cream around her eyes. No positive energy, I tell you. You could say that again, Lexi murmured under her breath. It felt like her mother had sucked all the air, along with any good vibes, out of the bathroom. What did you say? Nothing. Her mother's reflection in the mirror flashed her a dubious look. For someone who was only 5 feet tall, her mother had the uncanny ability to make everyone around her feel even smaller. Lexi straightened her posture, trying her best not to succumb to her insecurities. Her mother's eerily calm yet intimidating tone made her feel like a girl in pigtails again. Only her father could ever make her mother smile. How's Daddy? Is he here too? She asked hopefully. Not this time. He is away on business, but he does send his love and congratulations. She finished checking her appearance in the mirror and turned around to face Lexi. When were you going to tell me you're engaged? I'm engaged? Lexi's head spun with confusion. She quickly lowered her voice, remembering Charlie was still asleep in her room at the other end of the suite. Who did you hear that from? Tiffany. But the real question is why you didn't tell me this news yourself? Lexi's mouth grew dry. She barely knew how to answer before her mother continued speaking again. So, when do I get to meet this boy? Leaning close, she lowered her voice as if divulging a secret. From what Thomas said, he's barely old enough to vote. Ma, Thomas doesn't know what he's talking about. Lexi threw up her hands in frustration. And why are you still keeping in touch with my ex-husband? And his new fiancé? Thomas is family. Once a son, always a son. She strode out of the bathroom, waited for Lexi to exit, and promptly shut the door. Now tell me about this new son-in-law of mine, James. How old is he exactly? He's 30, but he's not your son-in-law. Lexi's stomach twisted as her mother entered her bedroom, opened her suitcase, and began unpacking. Her worst nightmare was coming true. How long are you planning on staying, Ma? Because my schedule's packed with work and there won't be much time for me to entertain you. I don't want you to get bored, she added sweetly. Mrs. Turner dismissed her concern with a wave of her hand. You don't need to worry about me. I can entertain myself. I'm sure Charlie will be more than happy to play cards with me. I can also get to know your future husband. I hear he's a chef. Perhaps I can teach him some Chinese dishes. Oh, this was getting out of hand, fast. It was time to set the record straight. Lexi took a deep breath and walked over to where her mother stood by the closet. Ma, please sit down for a minute. I need to explain something to you. All right. Surprisingly, her mother made no qualms about the request and sat down on the full-sized bed at the center of the room. Mrs. Turner clutched the yellow sweater she was holding to her chest. A weary look crossed her usually stoic face. I suppose I should rest a bit. I'm pretty worn down from flying all night. The doctor did warn me not to overdo it. Doctor? I didn't know you were seeing a doctor. Concerned, Lexi rushed over to sit next to her mom. What's going on, Ma? Heart palpitations. I've been having them for a few months now. Stress seems to trigger them. I came here hoping to relax. I didn't want to be home alone without your father. You understand, don't you, Alexandra? Of course, Ma. You're welcome to stay however long you like, Lexi insisted, wondering if she'd regret her words. She usually couldn't handle her mother in more than small doses, but given the circumstances, she decided to be gracious. Do you want to take a nap? I need to go to work, but I'll check in on you during my lunch break. Yes, a nap sounds good. Thank you, dear. Mrs. Turner gave her cheek a soft pat. What was it you wanted to tell me? Nothing much. It can wait. Her mother nodded as she took her shoes off and lay back on the bed. Will you bring James by later? Meeting him will be like medicine for my heart. I've been so worried about you being all alone here in Texas. But now that you're getting married, I don't need to worry anymore. Her mother's eyes closed as she repeated sleepily, no need to worry. Lexi pulled the blanket over her mother and watched her doze off. She released the breath she'd been holding, then squeezed her eyes shut. What were the odds that this was all a dream? She opened one eye slowly, then the other. Nope, so not a dream. There was her mother snoring soundly, no doubt dreaming up wedding plans for her, and James. Oh, what a mess. Why hadn't she come out and told her mother there was no engagement, much less a boyfriend? Because she was a good, obedient Chinese daughter, that's why. A daughter who didn't want to exacerbate her mother's heart condition. How was she going to get out of this situation? Her first inclination was to go find James, but then what? Beg him to play her fiancé again? That's how she had gotten into this mess in the first place. But what else could she do? Her mother's health depended on this. She quickly got dressed for work and left the cabin. Her boot-clad feet headed straight for the kitchen in search of her best friend. When she arrived at the door of the mess hall, several ranchers tipped their hats to her in greeting as they exited the place. The aroma of maple syrup and bacon filled her nose as soon as she walked into the room. There in the middle of one of the long empty tables sat James. He looked up in surprise when she entered, then gestured for her to sit down beside him. "Grab a plate, Lex. There's plenty of food left." Lexi bypassed the food table with its large aluminum trays of all her favorite breakfast foods. Had it been any other day, she would have piled her plate high with buttermilk biscuits and gravy, and fried chicken and waffles, but she had no appetite today. Instead, she took hesitant steps toward James, who looked especially handsome in a blue checkered shirt that matched his eyes. She sat down next to him. "I'm not really hungry right now. It's been kind of a crazy morning." James winced. "I know that look. Your mom called, didn't she?" "I wish she had." She sighed. "She did even better than that, or worse, depending on how you look at it." "She's coming to visit you?" James guessed. "Oh, it's worse, much worse." Lexi dropped her head into her hands. "She's here, as in sleeping in my bed right this very minute." "Oh, that explains why you're wearing your shirt inside out." "I am?" She glanced down at the flannel shirt she had thrown over a white tank top. Sure enough, the buttons running down the front were facing inward. "I sure am." "Here, let me." James helped Lexi take the shirt off, turned the sleeves inside out, and handed it back to her. "So, what's the occasion for the visit? To celebrate your birthday?" Shaking her head, she pulled her shirt back on. "You'll never guess why she decided to come." "I have no clue." "Are you going to give me all the deets?" he asked with an amused smile, "or should I take a guess?" Lexi swallowed hard. "She said she's here to meet my fiancé." James's face paled. "You're engaged?" "James, of course, I'm not engaged. But for some reason, Thomas and Tiffany told my mother we are." As much as the thought of getting married again scared her, she had to admit it didn't seem so bad once she said it loud. In fact, she rather liked the idea. James, however, couldn't have been more on the opposite side of the fence. He gawked, taking a moment to digest her words. "We? As in you and me?" She frowned. She couldn't miss the negative tone of his voice. It bordered on shock, maybe even disgust. Trying not to make the situation more awkward, or get her hopes up, she tamped down her excitement. "It's ridiculous, isn't it? They must have really bought our act." The word act reminded her of James's comment the other night, when he said he hadn't been acting. They had never finished that conversation. As much as she wished to address it now, there were more pressing matters at hand. "And to top it all off, I just found out my mom has a heart condition." "A heart condition? That sounds serious." "It's caused by stress. That's why I don't know what to do. If I tell her the truth, that we're not really engaged, she might have an episode. But if I let her believe we are," she scoffed softly. "I shouldn't even be going there." James grew quiet, rubbing the back of his neck as he thought. The color in his face slowly returned, along with a sparkle that lit up his baby blues. "What if we resumed our pretend relationship? Only until your mom leaves? We can tell her our double-date friends got it wrong, that we're dating and not engaged. But that piece of news might be enough for her. We'll let her see how happy you are, that's all a mother wants for her child. Then when she goes home, life will go back to normal." Lexi's eyes widened, her heart suddenly lighter. The gratitude bubbling up within her chest threatened to burst. She couldn't help it when she threw her arms around James's neck, surprising even herself with her reaction. "Thank you, James. This makes things so much easier. I was dreading the visit, but with this plan in place, it's going to be more than bearable." Of course. I'm happy to help. Lexi's body warmed as James's large hands rested on the small of her back. Goosebumps rose along her arms to be so close to him. He smelled amazing, like a warm spring day mixed with all her favorite spices. His embrace, strong yet gentle, made her feel so at home. She wished she didn't have to let go. She held on for an extra beat before pulling back. Thank you, James. You're such a good friend. His cheeks flushed at her compliment. He gave her his trademark smile, one side of his mouth curving up ever so slightly. Friends don't let friends suffer alone. I know you'd do the same for me. A flash of nostalgia went through her. She pulled her feet up onto the bench and hugged her knees to her chest. Well, you've done more than your share to be there for me. Ever since I came to Sage Valley, you've made me feel at home. You nursed my ego after getting beat up by Elvis, you've made me countless bowls of chile to drown my sorrows in, and you're always willing to listen without judgment. She took a deep breath as the reality of the situation hit her. I'm really going to miss you when you go on tour. He placed a hand on hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. I'm gonna miss you too. Lexi blinked in surprise. Those were the most honest and forthright words she'd ever heard from his lips. I think that's the most sentimental thing I've ever heard you say, James Scott. It's good to hear you speaking from your heart. He immediately blushed. Well, I'm not really a man of many words, she finished for him. I know. But I love every word you squeeze out of that sweet mouth of yours. Her cheeks heated as well. She really shouldn't be thinking about or even looking at his mouth again. That would only lead to thoughts of kissing. Lexi shook her head and quickly rose from her seat. I'm heading to the store now. Meet you for dinner? I'll bring my mom. James nodded. It's a date. Those 3 words bounced around Lexi's head as she made her way out of the mess hall. Even though this was all a ruse, she was more than thrilled to be playing pretend with James again. Chapter 12. James. James swallowed uncomfortably under the watchful eye of the Asian woman sitting across the table from him. He shoved a bite of chicken fried steak into his mouth, then stared down at his plate. If he wasn't eating dinner in the mess hall, surrounded by a dozen other people, he might wonder if he was on exhibit at the museum. Because the way Lexi's mother was looking him over, he sure felt like he was being studied. Isn't this chicken delicious, Ma? It's James's own recipe. Lexi looked over at him and smiled. It's not bad. A little too salty for my taste. But the mashed potatoes are decent. Thanks. James replied, a bit of uncertainty in his tone. He never imagined meeting Lexi's mother under these pretenses. But here they were, going through the motions of making small talk. At least Mrs. Turner wasn't giving him the 5th degree. He could take her criticizing his cooking as long as she didn't ask him any personal questions. James wasn't sure what to make of the older woman. At first glance, he thought she was as meek and harmless as a cat. Not the stray cats that roamed the ranch, but a small kitten that mewed. But looks were deceiving. Despite her small stature and delicate features, Mrs. Turner was more like a spunky mama tiger. He'd never met anyone like her. Even Nana's straightforward ways paled in comparison. Even still, his own mama had taught him to be polite. Perhaps all Lexi's mom needed was some southern hospitality. Lexi mentioned you enjoy cooking, Mrs. Turner. What kind of dishes do you like to make? Hot and sour soup. Peking duck. Honey walnut shrimp. I don't suppose you've had any of those before? No, I haven't. But I have heard about the famous dumpling restaurant, Din Tai Fung. It was featured on a food blog I follow. I'd love to try their dumplings someday. Mrs. Turner pursed her lips, delight lighting up her eyes. You want to try dumplings? No need to go all the way to Taiwan. I can make them for you. Mine are better. I would be honored. Thank you. Lexi flashed him an impressed smile and mouthed, "Wow." His stomach did a funny flip to see such joy in her eyes. This was the reason why he'd offered to roleplay with her again. He loved seeing her happy. A part of him didn't like lying to Lexi's mom, but he reasoned it was for a good cause. And when it all came down to it, he wasn't lying about his feelings for Lexi. He genuinely cared for her. If only he could speak as well as he cooked. "Isn't it fun that you and James share a love of food, Ma?" Mrs. Turner shrugged nonchalantly. "It is normal to like food. But to make a living off cooking is another matter. Do you plan to work as a chef all your life, James?" "I am not sure," he stammered honestly. "It's something I'm good at and enjoy, so I'm considering it. I figure I still have a couple of years to decide. I also have a degree in business that I can always fall back on," he added, hoping his mention of schooling would help his standing in Mrs. Turner's eyes. "You are handsome and smart?" Was that a rhetorical question? James laughed awkwardly as he thought of a way to answer. "I don't know about that, he's humble and kind, too." Lexi's voice held a note of admiration. James's shoulders relaxed as he returned Lexi's smile. She always knew the right things to say. "Thanks." Mrs. Turner took in their exchange and murmured something indiscernible under her breath. A line formed in between her brows, revealing her doubt. She aimed her dark brown eyes at James, pinning him in place with their intensity. "I can see why my Alexandra likes you, James, but what is it you see in her? Why are you dating my daughter? Are you after our family's money?" "Ma?" Lexi exclaimed. "James doesn't care about money. He's not like Thomas." "Lexi's right, ma'am. I'm not after anyone's money." "Well then," Mrs. Turner narrowed her eyes at James, "why would a young, virile man as yourself be interested in a 40-year-old divorcee?" Lexi made a strangled sound and began coughing up a storm. Her entire complexion reddened, as if she'd eaten a ghost pepper. "You okay?" James handed Lexi her glass of water and rubbed a hand down her back. She took a sip and nodded. "Just went down the wrong tube." James felt Mrs. Turner's eyes on him. He slowly raised his gaze to meet hers. He had a feeling she wasn't going to let him off the hook without a proper answer. He squared his shoulders, hoping his tongue cooperated. "When I see Lexi, I don't see her age or social status. She's my friend, my best friend." Mrs. Turner scoffed. "I know you are friends, but where is the love? The romance? You act like a stranger. What man doesn't give his girlfriend a kiss or even a hug when they greet each other? I see no chemistry between the two of you." James's mouth grew dry. No chemistry? If only Mrs. Turner knew how much his heart pounded in Lexi's presence. How he had to stop himself from planting a kiss on those full pink lips when she hugged him that morning. It took every ounce of self-restraint to not get caught up in her beauty. He'd been holding back even more tonight out of respect for Mrs. Turner. But his plan was backfiring. Lexi's mother was a lot harder to fool than Thomas and Tiffany. He took a gulp of water, both to buy himself some time and to cool his heated face. "Ma, James is a Southern gentleman," Lexi remarked. "He's very respectable. He wouldn't do anything to make you feel uncomfortable. That's the reason why he's holding back. Isn't that right, honey?" She added the term of endearment with an overly sweet smile. "Exactly right, sweetheart." He winced at the hesitation in his voice. He wasn't going to win any Academy Awards, much less convince Mrs. Turner, with this lousy performance. It was time to do better. "I do care about your daughter, deeply. I'm just not the best at expressing myself." Lexi's mother glared at him, unconvinced. She turned her attention to her daughter, shaking her head in pity. "Mingzhu, you are falling for his good looks and charm, just like you fell for Thomas's. I thought you learned your lesson, but you are again letting your emotions cloud your judgment." "Ma, it's not like that." Lexi's voice faltered. Her shoulders fell like a souffle that had been taken out of the oven too early. I was inexperienced then, idealistic. I'm not like that anymore. I'm older now. I know what love is. Do you? Because you tell me you and James are not serious enough to get married, that there is no engagement. I don't understand why you would break it off. Tiffany told me, what Tiffany told you was wrong, Lexi cut in. She's a sweet girl, really she is, but she watches too much reality TV. James and I were never engaged. I don't know why she told you that. But why not? Why do you not want to marry my daughter? She directed the question at James, along with an accusing stare. If you say she is your best friend, you do not want to string her along. She does not have time to waste at her age. James's jaw muscle twitched. The mess hall had grown considerably quiet. Most of the employees had left, but the one table that still had people were trying, very conspicuously, to listen in on their conversation. He attempted to keep his voice low as he answered, I promise you I'm not stringing Lexi along. I would never do anything to hurt her. Mrs. Turner rushed on, dismissing his words with a wave of her hand. These young men think they can say a few sweet words to win you over, but they are worthless without actions to back them up. If this man does not want to commit to you, Alexandra, he is not worth your time. If he truly loved you, you would know. Do not give your heart away so easily. A mixture of emotions flickered across Lexi's face. Chewing on her lower lip, she set her fork down slowly. You're right. I shouldn't be falling for someone who doesn't feel the same way about me as I do him. But that's my issue, Ma, and something I have to deal with. Please don't take it out on James. It's not his fault. She cleared her throat. I'm not feeling so well. I'm going to head back. Night. She avoided their gazes as she picked up her tray and walked away. James's head spun, watching her. He'd sensed a shift in Lexi's mood during those last seconds, something in her that had reacted personally to her mother's words. There was too much raw emotion, too much honesty in Lexi's reaction to be made up. But what had happened? What did she mean by falling for someone who didn't return her feelings? Only Lexi held the answers to those questions. James rose from his seat with a hurried, "Excuse me," and rushed out the door after her. Chapter 13. Lexi. Lexi held a clipboard in one hand while she counted the mugs on the store shelf. Instead of going back to her cabin and inevitably facing her mother, she had decided to get some work done. Mindless activity soothed her, especially when she needed something to keep her hands busy while her mind raced. Chewing a pencil between her teeth, she grunted the numbers out loud. 8, 9, 10. The door opened from behind, surprising her. She called out over her shoulder, "Sorry, we're closed. I'm just doing inventory. Come back in the morning." The sound of heavy boots reached her ears, echoing throughout the store. She paused her counting and turned around to find a familiar pair of blue eyes staring back at her. She quickly removed the pencil from her mouth. "James? What are you doing here?" Pulling his Stetson off his head, James gave Lexi a tight-lipped smile. He took 2 steps forward, his long legs bringing him to her side. Almost a foot taller, he cocked his head to meet her gaze. "I came to look for you. I stopped by your place then went to the stable, thinking you might have gone to talk to Shiloh. I figured work was the last place you'd be. I needed something to keep me busy." Lexi sighed as she stared up at him. "I appreciate you coming, but I'm really not in the mood to talk right now, James. I just need some space." He nodded, then took a few steps back. "Well, I don't mind standing over here if that'll make you feel better." "Very funny." She rolled her eyes with a droll smile. "I suppose that's a good distance." Lexi returned to doing inventory, checking off items on her list and making notes of which ones to order more of. From the corner of her eye, she felt James watching her carefully and quietly. She met his gaze and felt her stomach drop. He really was so sweet. And handsome. Why did he have to be the whole package? Need some help? I'm pretty good at counting. You don't mind? Of course not. Friends don't let friends do inventory by themselves. She chuckled softly. You keep taking my line. I put my own spin on it though. He nodded at the clipboard. So, what's next on the list? Salsa. And then the jellies. They both got to work, finishing up the inventory for all the food items in 10 minutes. When they were done with that aisle, they moved on to the next one. In the middle of counting the toiletries, toothbrushes, aspirin, and other essentials guests often forgot to bring, they got into a good rhythm. Lexi called off an item, James counted it, and she jotted down the numbers. As the minutes passed, Lexi began to relax and forget her worries from dinner. She also noticed the distance between her and James lessened to the point that they stood side by side, only a few inches apart. She easily got a whiff of his masculine scent with every breath she took. She found herself staring at his profile as he counted magnets. With intense concentration, he brushed a stubborn lock of hair that kept falling into his eyes. It was the sweetest image. She held up her index fingers and thumbs to make a rectangular frame around his face. Noticing her hand motions, James turned to look at her. Are you taking a picture of me? In my mind. I'll have to remember to bring my camera with me the next time we do inventory. Next time? You mean I get to help you out again? If you ask nicely, she teased. But seriously, thanks for helping, James. It makes the time go by so much faster. Of course. He paused. If I ask nicely, will you tell me what happened at dinner? I know you won't be able to sleep unless you talk about it. James knew her so well, too well. She needed to talk, but if she did, she wouldn't be able to contain the emotions she'd tried so hard to keep in check tonight. Being around her mother always brought up old wounds, insecurities she didn't want to think about. With James in the picture, it would only get more complicated. She couldn't talk to him about her feelings for him. Long story short, my mother manages to bring out the worst in me. He stuffed his hands into his jean pockets and nodded. I get that. She packs a punch with her words. Has she always been like this? Lexi scoffed. She was actually worse growing up. I think old age has mellowed her out some. Not enough though. She turned her attention to the shelf again and shifted some items around. Soon, the colorful magnets began to blur as tears swam in her eyes. She hadn't wanted to go there, but it was too late now. The floodgates had been cracked open, and her defenses were falling, fast. It was as if her body knew James was there, his broad shoulders and strong arms offering her the comfort she needed. She threw up her hands in surrender. Why fight it? If she was going to cry, she might as well do it now, out of her mom's scrutinizing eyes. With a groan of defeat, she slid to the ground, dropping her clipboard and pencil to the floor. James immediately lowered himself next to her. He reached over and wrapped her in a warm embrace, holding her trembling body to his. Hey now, it'll be okay. Hiding her face in his chest, Lexi shook her head. I'm sorry. I try so hard to not let her get to me. It's like she just has to get the last word in and prove she's right and I'm wrong. But what she said is true. My life is a mess. I'm a mess. I'm almost 40 and still clueless. I thought I'd have everything figured out by now. I feel even more lost than I did 20 years ago. At least back then, there was so much more potential, so many possibilities. Now, the only thing I have is a boatload of regret and endless souvenir magnets to keep track of. She sniffled and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. You're lucky, James. You've still got so much life ahead of you. You can try new things and pursue your dreams. It's good you're going on tour. If I were 10 years younger, I'd get on a bus and get out of here, too. James stiffened at her words, loosening his hold. You'd leave Sage Valley? A little calmer now, Lexi drew back from his arms and sat up straight. Wrapping her arms around her legs, she leaned her chin on her knees. His question made her think twice. Would she really leave this place she'd called home for the past year? Maybe she should. Especially now that James would be leaving as well. There was nothing holding her back. I would, she answered with more conviction. I'd live closer to the ocean. I miss the water, the salty air, the feel of sand between your toes. I'd go back to Hawaii if I didn't have to see my mother. If I moved back there, she'd insist I live with them, which would be a bad idea for everyone involved. She scoffed. Anyhow, I want to be independent for once in my life. James was quiet for a moment. I didn't know you felt this way. I thought you liked it here at the ranch. I kind of assumed you'd stay for a while. I do love it here. It's exactly what I needed this past year to recover from the divorce and to find myself again. But now that I'm not crying every day, she rolled her eyes, maybe it's time I went after my dreams. James sat quietly, giving her a thoughtful look. And what's that? What is it you want to do? She pretended to hold a camera in her hands, clicking a virtual button with her index finger. I'd travel and take photos. That's what I used to do when I was a flight attendant. Take pictures of places and people. Just get out there and experience life. You should do it, Lex. It's easier said than done. I need to make a living. No one's going to pay me to take pictures. Not with an attitude like that. He smirked. You'll never know until you try. Nana thinks your work is good enough for the ranch's website, so you already earned yourself your first customer. My first non-paying customer. Your first non-paying customer of many paying customers to come. You tell great stories with your photos. I know people will pay for them. You just have to sell your product, like how you sell stuff in the store. He gestured to the stocked shelves around them. Except that yours will be one of a kind. Lexi glanced over at James and couldn't help but smile. She already felt loads lighter just talking to him. You really know how to cheer me up. One corner of his mouth quirked up in a sweet smile. I didn't know that was possible to do without a bowl of chili. Laughing, she bumped her shoulder against his playfully. Hey, don't make fun of my fondness for chili. An obsession is more like it. He winked, then leaned in close to nudge her with his elbow. Their gazes locked as they came face to face. They both held themselves still as if under a strong, magnetic pull. Lexi blinked once, mesmerized by the tenderness in James's bright blue eyes. He reached out slowly to brush a lock of hair from her cheek. His thumb lingered there, caressing her skin with a gentle touch. His gaze lowered to her mouth. Heart pounding, she wondered if he was going to kiss her. More than anything, she wanted him to. But James suddenly broke off his gaze and scrambled to his feet. It's getting late. We have a big day ahead of us tomorrow. Tomorrow? Oh yeah, my birthday. James offered her his hand, pulling her up. He immediately released his grip and put his hat back on his head. I'll pick you up at 9. Bring a swimsuit. Lexi watched James walk off, almost breaking into a run as he neared the front door. She released the breath she'd been holding. She and James had almost kissed. Could things get any more complicated? Chapter 14. James. James released a long breath as he strode along the dusty road outside the store. The moonlight shone down, illuminating a path for him straight to the stable. He pulled open the door and stepped in, finding a sense of comfort in the familiar smell of hay and horses. Stepping up to Shiloh's stall, he greeted him with a tip of his hat. The horse glanced his way, then returned to eating. Leaning his back against the wooden fence, James paused to think. The place Lexi usually escaped to was now a refuge for him as well as he contemplated what had just happened. He'd been a heartbeat away from kissing Lexi. It had taken everything in his willpower to pull himself back. The last thing he wanted to do was muddy the waters between him and his best friend. They had such a good thing going. He and Lexi could talk about most anything. It meant the world to him that she would confide in him. They also laughed so easily together. But she'd made it clear that Sage Valley was just a rest stop along the way to her next adventure. And he would soon be leaving the ranch for a life on the road. Even if his absence was temporary, the reality of the situation was permanent. He and Lexi couldn't be anything more. His chest tightened to think of it. He turned around and perched his forearms on the top of the fence. Shiloh lifted his head to meet his gaze, his dark brown eyes seeming to plead with him. Either that, or he was blaming him for Lexi's inevitable departure. "She's not leaving yet, boy." The horse snorted, blowing air from his nostrils. He shook his head, his dark mane swaying with the sudden movement. He stared at James and approached him. "But when she does, you're going to say it's my fault, aren't you?" James scoffed. He couldn't believe he was having a conversation with an animal. Even still, this one-sided dialogue was helping him process through his thoughts. If Shiloh was willing to listen, he'd share his heart. "I can't make Lexi stay. As much as I want to, she's a grown woman with a mind of her own. She has dreams. Dreams bigger than staying in Sage Valley. She has talent, too. Have you seen the pictures she takes? She makes even me look presentable." The horse whinnied. Using his nose, he nudged James's arm once, then twice. James reached out and rubbed the bridge of Shiloh's nose. "It's so easy talking to you. If only you could talk back, boy. I really could use some words of wisdom." Footsteps suddenly sounded behind James, surprising him. Over his shoulder, he spotted a Stetson sitting on top of a head of gray hair. The friendly, smiling face of his great-uncle came into view. Bucky strode over, hands in the pockets of his worn jeans. "Evening, James, I came to check on the horses." "What are you doing here?" "Hey, Bucky." James greeted him with a nod. "Just having a heart-to-heart with our friend here. For some reason, I have an easier time talking to four-legged animals than people." Bucky grunted in agreement. He stepped up to greet Shiloh with a carrot. "I suppose us only children tend to get used to talking to ourselves. I remember you being so quiet as a kid, you had Nana worried for a while. I told her not to worry, it took me a while to open up. Meeting her definitely helped. She likes to take all the credit for my blossoming. Honestly, how could anyone not open up around that woman?" James chuckled. He had always felt like a kindred spirit with Bucky, especially when he was younger. Nana might have been the one he spent the most time talking, or rather listening, to, but Bucky was the one he felt the most comfortable with. "I never asked, but how did you work up the nerve to ask Nana out? You don't think I won her over with my silent charm?" He winked. "Or at least with my good looks." Shiloh neighed, causing both men to laugh. "I don't know if he's agreeing or disagreeing with you," James joked. "He's a smart one, this boy." Grinning, Bucky fed Shiloh another carrot. "Honestly? I just did it. It took all the guts I had to spit out the words, but I have to give credit to your Nana for being patient with me. We were good friends for a while before she started seeing me as someone more. I knew there was something different one day when I caught her looking at me a little longer than she used to. Then there was the accidental brushing of hands when we walked together. One day we bumped into each other when we stood up at the same time, and she literally fell into my lap. I looked into her eyes, she looked into mine, and I kissed her. After that, we were inseparable." "Wait, so you didn't officially ask her out?" "Nah. I figured my mouth was better off doing the convincing." Humor coated his words, his eyes twinkling. "I don't think she minded. Still doesn't to this day." Smiling, James nodded. He almost had a similar chance to show Lexi how he felt without using his words too, but he'd passed that up. What would she have done if he'd kissed her? He had no idea, and he likely would never know. Bucky eyed him curiously. I know that look, boy. It's the same one you had when you were 11 or 12, and you were helping Nana in the kitchen. You couldn't get your sausage gravy right. It was either too runny or too thick. You looked as sad as a rooster who'd lost his voice. The memories of that summer day flooded James's mind. How he'd followed the recipe to a T, yet he still didn't get the results he wanted. He'd almost given up, but he'd decided to give it one more shot. Good thing he did, because that's when he discovered his love of cooking. He'd learned that day how patience, perseverance, and effort paid off. I remember. Nana wouldn't let me give up either. She sat with me and helped me figure out the ingredients I needed, which ones went well together and which ones didn't. I owe my career to her. Bucky beamed. You found your voice that day. I guess you could say that. Cooking is how I express myself. So, why don't you use your God-given talent and skills, he gave James a pointed look, to tell Lexi how you feel? Huh? You're telling me to use my cooking to win Lexi over? I do that practically every day, but look where it's gotten me. Deep in the friend zone. Then try a different approach, a different recipe, if you will. Bucky emphasized the word recipe, with a quirk of his brow. Be creative. You'll figure something out. Shiloh nudged James's arm as he looked from him to Bucky and back again. He snorted as if agreeing with the older man. James rubbed his chin, the gears in his head starting to turn. Maybe Bucky was onto something. Shiloh certainly thought so. A man experienced in love and a horse who'd already won the heart of the woman he loved couldn't be wrong. An idea began forming in his mind, bubbling like a simmering pot of chile. Food. That was it. He knew the way to Lexi's stomach, maybe he also knew the way to her heart. Thanks for the chat, Bucky. I've got some things to prepare for tomorrow. James tipped his hat toward his great-uncle before turning to go. Anytime. James headed to his own place of solace on the ranch, the kitchen. He was going to whip up the tastiest food for Lexi's birthday, along with a special gift just for her. It was going to be a long night, but Lexi was worth it. Chapter 15. Lexi. Lexi held herself still as the other side of her mattress gave way when her mother turned over in the bed they were sharing. Eyes closed, she pretended to sleep, as she'd been doing for half the night to avoid conversation. Thanks to jet lag, her mother had stayed up reading a book and had finally gone to sleep around 5 in the morning. 3 hours later, Lexi was wide awake and waiting for the perfect opportunity to escape the cabin unnoticed. The last thing she wanted was to get caught up in a mother-daughter interrogation session. When her mother's breathing evened out, Lexi snuck out of bed and tiptoed to the bathroom to change. She threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt over a bright yellow tankini set with white polka dots. Her stomach fluttered as she applied a coat of waterproof mascara and some light pink lip gloss. After running a brush through her hair, she took a good look at herself in the mirror. Her dark brown eyes, now surrounded by a few laugh lines, twinkled with anticipation even as doubt coursed through her. Puffing out her cheeks, she released a long breath. Here she was approaching midlife and feeling like a teenager going on her first date. Even worse, she had all the questions that went along with a first date. How was she supposed to act around James? What if he kissed her? If he did, should she kiss him back? She shook her head quickly. What was she doing? She shouldn't even be thinking about kissing James, much less dating him. This was a simple outing between friends, nothing more. The fact that he had run off last night proved he didn't want anything more than friendship. That was a fact she needed to accept. She was getting too old to play pretend. Lexi emerged from the bathroom into the darkened room and made her way to the front door. She was half an hour early to meet James, but she'd rather spend it out of harm's way, specifically, her mother's presence. Opening the door, she stepped outside, releasing a sigh of relief, only to suck it back in when her mother stirred. She had almost closed the door when a loud, tinny voice called out, Mingzhu, where are you going? Cringing, Lexi pushed the door open a crack and stuck her head into the room. Ma, it's still early. Go back to sleep. Exactly. Mrs. Turner sat up in bed, narrowing her eyes at Lexi. Where are you off to this early in the morning, and on your birthday too? Thanks for remembering, Lexi replied drolly. Her mother wasn't one for sentimental gestures. The mere fact that she remembered her birthday was good enough. I'm just going to get some breakfast. I didn't want to disturb you since you went to bed so late. She scoffed. Do you know why I couldn't sleep last night, Alexandra? Because of jet lag? Sensing a lecture coming, Lexi took a step back into the bedroom, one hand still on the doorknob. It is a 5-hour time difference. I am worried about you. You deserve someone better than that chef. If he does not appreciate you enough to ask you to marry him, you are better off without him. She pointed a finger in Lexi's direction. You are too good for him. Ma, that's not true. Lexi felt her cheeks flush with indignation. Even though it touched her in an odd way to hear her mother coming to her defense, she had no right to speak of James this way. She couldn't let her mother go on like this. It was time to come clean, regardless of the consequences. The truth is, James and I aren't dating. We only pretended to be so Thomas would think I'd moved on and I'm doing well without him. I had no idea the news would get back to you. Please don't be upset. I didn't think you'd travel all the way here once you found out. Her mother clutched the area over her heart, disapproval hardening her features. Even with her cream-colored cotton pajamas on and a blanket pulled up to her chest, she still appeared poised and in control. Do you still love Thomas? No. Lexi exclaimed, absolutely not. I've been over him for a while. I know it was silly, but when I saw him with Tiffany, I wanted to show him I found someone, too. Except that I hadn't yet, so I had to improvise. Mrs. Turner took a few deep breaths while grimacing. Are you feeling all right, Ma? Your heart isn't acting up, is it? She paused, eyeing her mother cautiously. She took a step forward, ready to rush over to her mother's side. Her mother waved her away. Then who is it you are interested in? There's no one, Ma, the one you mentioned last night at dinner, the man who doesn't feel the same for you. Who were you talking about? Lexi chewed her lower lip as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Why did her mother have to remember every little detail of the conversation? Every part of her was eager to escape this inquisition if only it were possible. How was she going to get out of this one? I was going along with the role I was playing. You like him? Who? The chef. James? No, I told you we were pretending, he lied, her mother cut in, her cheeks flushing. He lied when he said he would never hurt you. Ma, he didn't lie. He would never do anything to hurt me. He's the sweetest man I know. He's one of my closest friends. See, you are already falling for him. Don't deny it. I know you well enough to know when you are lying. Lexi stopped short of rolling her eyes. She knew better than to show any disrespect to her mother, but it was getting harder to keep a straight face. This conversation was getting out of hand. She didn't need her mother meddling in her life. Ma, I know you mean well, but I'm 40 years old. I can handle my personal affairs on my own. You don't need to worry about who I like or don't like. I'm actually fine being single, I am. Then why did you lie to your ex-husband? Why did you lie to me? Her mother's tone hardened. And why are you lying to yourself? You are clearly in love with the chef. Lexi sucked in a sharp breath. Hearing her mother's words felt like a punch to the gut. Why did she still care about her mother's opinion of her after all these years? If only she were confident enough to own her struggles and failures. Hot tears filled her eyes, threatening to betray her. To be honest, she didn't like being alone as much as she claimed. She may have seemed like a big girl, running off to Texas to start a new life, but if it weren't for Charlie and the Buchanans welcoming her with open arms, she would have been lost. Then there was James, the handsome cowboy with his listening ear and a steady supply of chili who'd been there for her from day one. He had played such a big part in her life this past year. Her heart ached at the thought of being at the ranch without him. Who was she going to talk to and laugh with when he was gone? She couldn't depend on James anymore. It was time for her to grow up. She reined in her emotions, determined to feel and act like the adult she was. 40 was no joke. God willing, she had probably lived half or close to half her life already. She'd certainly already made enough mistakes for a lifetime. This new decade would be different, better. She could learn to be on her own. Speaking in a firm, hopefully convincing tone, she replied to her mother as much as to herself, "I appreciate your concern, Ma, but I know the truth. And the truth is, there's no future for me and James. Now, please trust me to live my life." She paused, gripping the doorknob tightly. "I need to go. I'll be back late tonight, so I'll see you then." She took a deep breath and stepped back, pulling the bedroom door shut. With a barrier between her and her mother, she could breathe freely again. Her shoulders immediately relaxed, sending waves of relief through her body. What a stressful way to start her birthday. But a part of her was happy she'd spoken her mind. It was time to start living with courage and faith in herself. Lexi rushed to the front door and opened it, immediately finding herself face to face with James's broad chest. Surprised, she lost her footing and fell into his open arms. Her nose ended up buried in the soft fabric of his t-shirt, inhaling an amazing scent of soap and spices as he held her close. The moment was perfect, except for the fact that this was everything she wanted but couldn't have. She quickly pulled away, a sheepish smile on her face. "Hey, sorry, I didn't see you. How long have you been standing here?" "Not long." He tipped his Stetson in her direction and gave her a small smile. "Everything good?" "Yeah, everything's great. Let's get this show on the road." Lexi followed James's lead to his car, eager to start her birthday celebrations. A day spent with her best friend, what more could she ask for? Chapter 16. James. James shifted in his seat, his limbs growing stiff from sitting in the car too long. 2 hours had passed since he and Lexi left Sage Valley, and they were close to their destination. He glanced over at Lexi, whose head kept bobbing up and down as she dozed off. To his relief, she'd fallen asleep as soon as they had reached I-37 South, leaving him to his own thoughts. There was so much on his mind, he was thankful for the silence. Usually, he enjoyed bantering with his best friend, but today, he just didn't have the heart. Not when he was about to leave on tour tomorrow. James blew out a frustrated breath as he turned off the highway. Lexi's position shifted as they drove over some bumps in the road, and her head fell onto his shoulder. The sweet fragrance of honeysuckle filled his senses, making his chest tighten. Her hair fell over her cheekbone, but he could spot a smile curving her full lips. The sight was so mesmerizing, he nearly forgot to watch for the traffic in front of him. When he finally tore his eyes away and looked up, he had to slam on the brakes to keep from hitting the car before him. The truck jerked to a stop, causing both him and Lexi to lurch forward. Lexi jumped, eyes wide open. "What happened?" "Sorry, I braked a little late." He gave her a sheepish smile. "How'd you sleep?" "So good. I hardly got any rest last night with my mom next to me. This nap was just what I needed." Stretching her arms out, she sighed happily. "So, are you going to tell me now where we're going?" "See for yourself." James pointed out her passenger window toward a wide expanse of blue. "It's not the Pacific, but I hope it'll do. Welcome to Port Aransas." Lexi gasped, then opened her window. A fresh breeze of salty air shot in the truck, ruffling her dark hair. She turned to him with the brightest smile. James. You brought me to the beach? Of course. Friends don't let friends miss out on what they want for their special day. Happy birthday, Lexi. You deserve the best. She reached up to give his neck a squeeze, holding on for an extra beat. This is the best surprise ever. Thank you, she whispered in his ear. Oh, I'm getting all emotional. I need to stop. No more crying. James's heart soared to have her so close, then immediately sank when she pulled away. He swallowed hard and kept his eyes on the road. This isn't the best part though. He steered the truck onto a street parallel to the ocean, then made a right turn onto the beach itself. A few yards down, he stopped and parked perpendicular to the shoreline. The beach was quiet as expected for a Monday, so they had a good stretch of sand all to themselves. The weather couldn't have been better if he'd planned it. With a sky clear of clouds and the waves rolling in, it was everything he'd wanted to give Lexi for her birthday. At least he could make her happy. There, now we have the perfect view for lunch. This is amazing. I can't believe we can drive on the beach. Yeah, it's one of the cool things about this place. He opened his door and gestured for her to follow. Come on, I packed a picnic for us. After retrieving the items they needed from the truck bed, James led Lexi to a spot in front of the truck. They set up a beach umbrella and laid down a blanket, then removed their outer clothing before sitting down. James swallowed hard when he saw Lexi in her swimsuit that showed off her slender curves and smooth skin. He couldn't help but notice her lingering gaze when he took off his shirt. He wanted to dwell on that simple sign, but he also didn't want to get his hopes up. His heart sank as he considered ditching his whole plan for today. Why pour out his heart now, only to have Lexi reject him? He took out 2 large containers, one marked with the letter L in Sharpie from an insulated bag. He presented Lexi with the unmarked box. I tried my best to make this as authentic as possible. I really wanted to give you a taste of home. Lexi looked at him curiously as she opened her container. She pulled out a rectangular block of rice wrapped in a sheet of dried seaweed with a piece of lunch meat sandwiched in between. You made me spam musubi? I haven't had one in so long. Thank you, James. You're welcome. Let's dig in. James ate his musubi quickly, taking care to keep it hidden behind his hand in between bites. He couldn't risk Lexi seeing the shape he'd cut his particular one out in. Is yours different from mine? Lexi asked as she peeked into his container at the second musubi sitting there. It looks like a heart. I got bored with rectangles and decided to try something different. His face heated, his excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. How's yours taste? It's delicious. I think the heart looks cute. She smiled. Oh, did you happen to bring something to drink? Oh yeah, of course. Let me grab them. He retrieved 2 cans of coconut water from the bag and handed her one. He also passed her a container of macaroni salad, once again keeping the one marked with an L for himself. Almost forgot about this. This looks so good, Lexi remarked as she popped open the lid on her box. Hey, how come your containers all have a letter on them and mine don't? No reason. James set his container aside and popped open his can. He took a long swig, hoping to avoid answering any more of Lexi's questions. His face heated as he thought about how embarrassing it would be if she saw the pasta he'd used for the salad originally meant for her. You're hiding something, James. What's so mysterious about a box of macaroni salad? Lexi grabbed his container and opened it, brow quirking as she peered inside. Heart-shaped pasta? James choked, swallowing more liquid at once than he intended. He sensed Lexi's eyes on him, dark and intense. How was he supposed to explain this away? I had some leftover pasta from our Valentine's barbecue that I wanted to use up. Lexi grew quiet. Is that the only reason? Yeah, of course. She nodded thoughtfully, her features softening. It's just that, it was making me wonder if. Wonder what? Nothing, it's nothing. She pointed at her salad with her fork and smiled. This is so good. Everything about this day is wonderful. I couldn't imagine a better way to spend my birthday than at the beach with my best friend. Me either, James answered in a heartfelt tone. Their gazes locked, and the tenderness he saw in her eyes made it hard to think straight. He reached out to touch her face, wishing he could capture the look in a timeless photo. Here on the sand, with the sound of the waves crashing and the warmth of the sun shining down along the edge of their blanket, things seemed simpler, easier. There was no need for words when one look, one touch said it all. If only they could stay this way. If only. A loud ringing cut through the peaceful moment. James dropped his hand as Lexi jumped up and searched for her phone in her purse. It's Charlie, she murmured as she answered the call. Hey, cuz. What? When? Is she okay? James looked to Lexi in concern. Okay, we'll come back now, but it's going to take us a couple of hours. Can you stay with her until then? Thanks, Charlie, she added before she hung up. What's going on? It's my mother. She fainted at lunch. Charlie says she's okay now, but I'd feel better checking on her myself. I'm sorry to cut our day short, but do you mind if we go back? Of course not. Let's go. James was on his feet, packing everything up. He placed all their half-eaten food back in the bag, next to 2 unopened containers. Their dessert would have to wait. He needed to get Lexi back to Sage Valley. Chapter 17. Lexi. Lexi undid her seatbelt as soon as James parked his truck back at the ranch. She was a jumble of nerves, needing to check on her mother but also concerned about her best friend. He'd been quieter than normal on their drive back from the beach. Only the country tunes on the radio had filled the long stretch of driving. The silence had given her plenty of time to think, though. Had James been trying to tell her something with the food he'd prepared? She could tell from the way he'd blushed at her questions that he was hiding something. And the moment they'd shared before her phone rang, she couldn't help but wonder what was going on in that beautiful head of his. Did he want more than friendship? Why was it so hard for him to come out and tell her? But maybe it was better to leave things unsaid. Her life was messy enough as it was. Even now she was still under her mother's thumb, pinned in place by her expectations. She talked a big talk about taking chances and having no regrets, but she didn't live that way. Would she ever get to that point? James turned off the engine and stated, I'm sorry your birthday didn't turn out as expected. She turned slowly toward him, not wanting their time together to end. It's not your fault. Thank you so much, James, for going out of your way and taking the time to plan such a great day for me. I loved seeing the ocean, and the food was amazing. But most of all, I enjoyed your company. James ducked his head, a small smile spreading across his lips. It wasn't a big deal, but I'm glad you were surprised. I was. I really wish we could have stayed longer. Maybe we can plan another trip back sometime? He hesitated. Sure, but it'll have to be later on in the year. The tour starts tomorrow. Her heart sank. She couldn't believe he was leaving so soon. That's right. She let out a heavy breath, her gaze dropping to her hands. So you have no idea how long you'll be gone for? Not yet, but I'll check in on a weekly basis and let Nana and Bucky know. I'd like to be back before summer rolls around. I know how busy it gets around here. She sighed. Speaking of being busy, she didn't want to think about how occupied James would be on the road, surrounded by enthusiastic band groupies. Well, I bet the time will pass by for you in a flash with all the places you'll be going. She lifted her head, a droll smile on her face. At least you won't be lonely with all those pretty young things screaming your name. His brows shot up. You mean the fans? They don't even know I exist, which is fine by me. You know, I'd rather be holed up in the kitchen cooking. I don't have the time or energy to socialize. Are you serious? You're more handsome than any of the band members. You should be out there meeting new people. Lexi cringed even as she spoke the words. She was definitely trying hard to sound unfazed by him leaving. Maybe too hard because his blue eyes suddenly clouded with hurt. It sounds like you really want me to go? James's voice was soft, unsure. You're only 30, James. You should have fun. Live it up. I know I'm 30, which is why I'm done playing around. That's why I'm taking this job, Lexi, to save up money for the future. I'm ready to settle down. She swallowed hard, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. At least one of them had a clear sense of direction. Good for you, planning ahead. Have you thought more about your plans for the future? Whether you're going to stick around or... James's voice trailed off as uncertainty left a line between his brows. Do you think you'll still be here when I get back? I don't know. My life is pretty up in the air right now, Lexi answered, her tone matter-of-fact. What she really wanted to ask was, do you want me to be here when you get back? She didn't want to be the reason for stopping James from fulfilling his dreams. She'd already messed up one life, her own. He deserved better. Certainly more than a woman struggling through a midlife crisis with a mother breathing down her neck. I should probably go see how my mother's doing. Thanks again for today. Will I see you before you go? I've got some last-minute packing to do. Then I need to go over some things with the kitchen staff. It's probably safer if we say our goodbyes now. Sure, okay. Lexi reached out with both hands, awkwardly waiting for him to meet her halfway. When he leaned over, she fell into his arms and buried her face in the crook of his neck. She breathed in his familiar masculine scent, trying to store it in her memories for when he was gone. He held her close and still with his chin on the top of her head. His gentle touch broke through all her reserves, and her composure crumpled. Hot tears seared her eyes, falling onto her cheeks before she could even blink. She bit her lower lip to keep from crying out loud, but it wasn't long before a sob escaped her mouth. Hey, what's wrong? James pulled back and cradled her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I just wish I'd met you earlier, like 10 or 15 years ago. She scoffed, calculating their ages in her head. Okay, not 15 years, maybe 12? When I was 18? Why? Life probably would have turned out differently for me. Sniffing, she gave him a wistful smile. It's too late now. You can't just start over at age 40. Oh my goodness, I'm 40 years old, and I'm a mess. Hey, no, you're not. You're beautiful, inside and out. James, you don't have to say that. She took his hands from her face and held them in her lap. She shook her head at his undeserved kindness. You don't have to lie because it's my birthday. It's the truth, Lexi. I know I don't say much, but I mean what I say. His voice grew husky with emotion. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever laid eyes on. Any man would be lucky. Lexi held her breath, waiting for him to finish his sentence. His eyes zeroed in on her mouth, and she was sure he was going to kiss her. He suddenly let go of her hands. Your mom, I think she's looking for you. He nodded to her passenger side window and cleared his throat. She jumped in her seat as a knock sounded on the glass. One turn of her head brought her face to face with the disgruntled expression on her mother's face. She held up a finger and mouthed the words, 1 second. Mrs. Turner's dark brown eyes were bright with awareness as they narrowed at Lexi. She stepped back and crossed her arms as she waited. Lexi turned back to James. I think she's feeling better now. Perhaps better wasn't the right word because her mother looked anything but pleased. Lexi wondered what she was going to criticize her about today. I should go. Please take care of yourself. She squeezed out a smile for him. There were so many things she wished she could say, but now wasn't the time. She would have to save them up for when, or if, James ever returned to Sage Valley. You, too, Lexi. Stay in touch. Sure. Bye, James, she managed to utter as she opened her door. Just as she was about to step out, James placed a hand on her arm. Wait, I almost forgot about dessert. He reached into the back seat of the truck and pulled out a brown paper bag. Here. You should put it in the fridge if you don't plan on eating it soon. Thanks, James. She took the bag from him, her skin tingling as her fingers brushed against his for one sweet second. Thank you for everything. My pleasure. Happy birthday. Lexi hopped out of the truck, her flip-flops landing in the dirt with a soft thud. Her heart heavy, she walked away from the one man who made her happy. She forced herself to not look back, knowing that doing so would start the tears falling. Instead, she picked up her chin, ready and determined to face her mother. Chapter 18. James. James hitched the strap of his duffel bag onto his shoulder as he boarded a large tour bus in Austin. He'd driven an hour to meet up with the band, who was headed to Houston for a show that night. The interior of the vehicle was as he remembered, brightly lit overhead with wooden paneling all around and shiny tile flooring. Four young men in jeans and t-shirts lounged on the leather sofas that faced each other on both sides of the bus. They were all focused on a large flat-screen TV, playing a video game with loud explosions. The smell of fresh coffee filled James's nose, letting him know the guys were likely recovering from a late night. He edged his way along the narrow walkway, tipping his hat in greeting at the tour manager, a young red-headed woman, who sat near the front of the bus. James, you made it. Adam, the lead singer, called out. He walked over and gave James a quick handshake. I'm so glad you're here. We've been eating junk the last 2 weeks. You think you can whip us up some green smoothies? James set down his bag and Stetson, ready to roll up his sleeves. The bus had barely started moving, but he was already set to work. Even though there were fewer mouths to feed here than at Sage Valley, he'd need to put in more time and effort to make sure everything he made was up to par. Celebrities were a different breed from ranchers. Sure thing. Coming right up. While Adam returned to the video game, James got started on the drinks. For a mobile kitchen, the setup on the bus had everything he needed and more. From the refrigerator, he got out some kale, spinach, and frozen fruit that the tour manager had stocked up for him. He threw all the ingredients into the large blender and turned it on, watching as the food turned a vibrant shade of green. While he waited, James pulled out his phone and checked his messages. He had texted Lexi right before he left to say goodbye. He'd hoped she would have replied by now, but only the screensaver photo appeared on the screen. It was a photo she had taken of the two of them a few months ago, at his birthday dinner. She'd surprised him by taking him line dancing. It was one of his best memories from this past year. He sighed, wishing the birthday celebration he had planned for her yesterday could have been just as memorable. He'd been so close to telling her how he felt. The moment had seemed so right, and the hopeful look in her eyes had just about convinced him that she might feel something more for him, too. But the timing had been completely off. Seeing Lexi's mother outside her window was a big wake-up call. He couldn't start something with Lexi when he was leaving on tour. Part of him was thankful they'd been interrupted before he said or did something he'd regret. But, oh, how he missed her. James. James looked up to find all 4 guys from the band calling out to him. They pointed at the blender and gave him thumbs-ups to let him know the smoothies were ready. He quickly shut the machine off. Once the loud whirring noise stopped, he could hear the guys laughing as they shook their heads in disbelief. How long had they been calling out to him? His face heated as he put his phone into his back pocket. Sorry, guys, I got distracted. Let me get these drinks to you. He poured the smoothies out into 4 tall glasses and handed them to the guys. Adam thanked him and asked, "So, are you gonna tell us what her name is?" "What?" "The girl you were thinking about." Adam winked. "Whoever it was that made you forget about our smoothies." James laughed uncomfortably. Was it that obvious?" "Oh yeah. She must be one heck of a woman to get you that distracted. Let's see her photo." He pulled his phone out again and turned the display in Adam's direction. Adam whistled appreciatively. "Dang, she's hot. Where'd you meet her?" "On the ranch. She moved to Sage Valley a year ago. We're best friends." "Best friends, right. That's about as true as the idea that I actually like green smoothies," he ribbed, elbowing James. "We both know you want her as much as I want a big chocolate donut right now." James scoffed softly. Adam was right on both counts. His weakness was sweets, while James's was Lexi. He couldn't cure his own problems right now, but he could at least help Adam with his. "You're in luck. I actually have some malasadas that I made yesterday." What?" "Malasadas. Portuguese donuts that are popular in Hawaii. Lexi, my friend's birthday was yesterday, and I made her some. I brought the extras if you guys want them." Adam's green eyes grew wide. "Yes, of course. Bring 'em here." James grabbed his duffel bag and unzipped it. He pulled out the paper bag he'd kept for himself after the beach trip, wondering if Lexi had eaten her share yet. He had remembered her mentioning them before and thought they'd be the perfect dessert for her birthday. Thankfully, he'd given them to her before she got out of the truck yesterday. He pulled the container from the bag and almost dropped the whole thing. His whole body tensed when he spotted the lid. It couldn't be. Where was the letter L that he'd written on top with black marker? He opened the box, hoping to see 4 heart-shaped golden brown malasadas sprinkled with powdered sugar inside. Instead, 4 round ones stared back at him. His heart stopped. He'd given Lexi the wrong container. "What's wrong, man?" Adam looked at him curiously. "You look like you just saw something you wish you hadn't." "You could say that again. Don't tell me there's something wrong with my donuts." "No, they're fine." James blew out a heavy breath as he handed the container to Adam. "Help yourselves. I need to make a call." "All right, man, thanks." James walked away, running his hands through his hair. How likely was it that Lexi had already opened her container? If she had and had already gotten to the bottom of the box. His heart clenched. If the note he'd left there was the reason why she wasn't replying to his texts, he'd really gone and messed up their friendship. What could he do now besides wait? Just do it, man. James turned around to find Adam with his brows raised in an exasperated look. "Do what?" "Call her. If she's the one you want, you gotta tell her. How else will you know if she'll be waiting for you when you get back?" James gulped. That was the very thing he was afraid of. It was now or never. All or nothing. He needed to come clean. Picking up his phone, he dialed Lexi's number. After a few rings, the call went to voicemail. "Howdy, you've reached Lexi. Leave me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I finish my bowl of chile. Thanks for your patience. You know I'd do the same for you, because friends don't let friends eat their chili cold. Hey, Lexi." James's voice faltered as he continued, "How are you? I was just wondering if you'd eaten the dessert I gave you. If you haven't yet, maybe you could just toss the container, and I'll make you a fresh batch when I'm back home. But if you have eaten them and happen to see the, note at the bottom of the box, and read it already," he rolled his eyes, frustrated by the jumble of words coming out of his mouth. "Just give me a call when you get this message. Please. I need to clear some things up. Thanks." James released the heaviest breath as he hung up. He had no idea if he'd just made things better or worse, but he was sure he'd find out soon enough. Chapter 19. Lexi. Lexi wrung her hands in her lap as she sat across from her mother on the bed. After she returned from the beach yesterday, her mother had barely spoken a word, choosing to give her the silent treatment instead. Lexi assumed she was getting a guilt trip for not being by her mother's side when she fell ill. Charlie had assured her over text, though, that her mother was fine and may even have been faking her fainting spell. As crazy as it sounded, the news didn't surprise Lexi. Her mother would do almost anything to get her way. But Lexi was tired of being collateral damage. It was time she spoke her mind in a loving but firm way. "Ma, how are you feeling?" Mrs. Turner pressed her thin lips together in a pout. She gave Lexi a sad look and sighed. "I'm not dying yet, if that's what you're asking." "I'm sorry I wasn't here when you fainted," Lexi began, keeping her tone as calm as possible, but Charlie said, "Charlie is not my daughter," her mother cut in. "I do not care about her the way I care about you. Do you not understand why I fell ill yesterday?" "What do you mean, Ma?" "I'm not following. When I heard from her where you had gone, it hurt me," she pointed to her chest, "right here. I knew you were thinking with your heart and not your mind. I didn't want to see you get hurt again." Lexi blinked. Were those tears she saw? She was having a hard time believing the words coming from her mother's mouth, but there was genuine sorrow in the dark brown eyes that mirrored her own. "I appreciate your concern, Ma, but I'm okay." She sighed dramatically. "I want you to be more than okay. You know this is why I keep in touch with Thomas, don't you? So I can find out what he is up to and tell you first. This way, you are never caught off guard. The worst thing is for you to hear all the news from someone else. Do you understand, Mingju?" A lump formed in Lexi's throat, making it hard to speak. Her mother's face blurred as hot tears seared her own eyes. Even if she could speak, she didn't know if there were words for her to convey how she felt. She'd misunderstood her mother's intentions all this time. Her mother hadn't been trying to hurt her. In a strange, roundabout way, she'd actually been trying to help. Could it be that her mother had a softer heart than she imagined? I didn't know that, Ma." Lexi choked back a sob and wiped the tears off her cheeks. "I thought you were disappointed, that somehow you cared about Thomas more than me. Foolish daughter, how could you ever think that? You are my flesh and blood. Even now that you are grown, I still worry about you. I worry you will be alone. I worry you will not be happy. It is not good for my heart to worry so much, that's why I came to see you. I just needed to see with my own eyes that you are well. Yet, I come here and find out you are not." She narrowed her eyes at Lexi. "Why do you play pretend with James when you love him for real?" Lexi sucked in a sharp breath. Love. That was a big word. Was that what she felt for James? "How do you know I love him? How can you not love him? I saw the way he looked at you yesterday when you were sitting in his truck. He looked at you as if you are a precious gem. That is why I gave you the name Mingju. It means bright pearl. I wanted you to know your own value, so you will find a man who knows your value. You love him because he treasures you. Am I right?" Lexi nodded readily. She stared at her mother, feeling like she was seeing her heart for the first time. "I don't think I've ever heard you say anything more beautiful or true, Ma." "I have my moments," Mrs. Turner touted. "Now, don't just listen to what I say and do nothing. Go find James and tell him how you feel." Lexi shook her head, feeling helpless. "He's gone, Ma. He left for a job off the ranch and won't be back for a while. The timing's just not right for us. Then call him and tell him to come back. He should be here with you." Her mother's cheeks darkened as she threw her shoulders back. "Once he knows how you feel, he will be back here like one of those cowboys riding a horse in the sunset. That's how your father's favorite movies always end. That's made up, Ma, not real life. Where do you think writers get their ideas from? Real life, of course. No writer is that original." She scoffed. "Now, where is your phone? Call that cowboy and tell him to come home." "I don't," Lexi began in protest until her mother pinned her tiger mom look on her. Under her watchful gaze, Lexi grabbed her phone from the side table and turned it on. To her surprise, she saw that she'd missed several texts, as well as a phone call, from James. There was also a new voicemail he'd left a few minutes ago. She held up the screen to show her mother. "He left me a message." "Go on," Mrs. Turner urged her. "Find out what he wants." Lexi held the phone up to her ear and listened. The mere sound of James's deep, smooth voice sent a wave of sadness through her, making her chest constrict. Oh, how she missed him already. Her heart began pounding as she heard his words. Dessert. Container. Note. When the voicemail ended, she set the phone down and turned to her mother, confused. "What did he say?" "I'm not sure. Something about the dessert he gave me for my birthday." "And? Did you eat it yet?" Her mother's tone grew impatient. "Where is it?" "I put it in the fridge." Lexi walked over to the mini refrigerator next to the small table by her bed. She took a brown paper bag out and removed the plastic container inside. With one finger, she traced the letter L that James had written on the lid in his familiar chicken scrawl. Heart racing, she opened the box. Her mother came up beside her, exclaiming as she peered inside the container. "Malasadas. Where did he find those in Texas? I have never seen them in that shape before." Lexi held up one perfectly fried golden brown donut. It, along with the 3 other malasadas in the box, were heart-shaped. Just like the musubi and pasta James had eaten yesterday. James didn't buy these, he made them. A cowboy who knows how to make malasadas. "Let me have a taste." "Here you go." Lexi handed the box to her mother, but not before she took out the small envelope sitting on the bottom. Her shoulders rose in anticipation as she pulled out the folded card inside. She had a feeling whatever was in this note would change her and James's relationship forever. Holding her breath, she slowly opened it. "Dear Lexi, happy birthday. By now, you'll notice there's a theme to the food I prepared for you. I wanted a fun way to tell you what's been on my heart." Lexi raised a brow. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. James had meant for her to have the heart-shaped food, but for some reason, he'd given her his portions instead. And from the way he'd fumbled through his voicemail, he had likely given her this box and note by mistake. But here it was, offering her a clearer message than James had ever given her. She took a breath as she continued reading. "As you know, I find it easier to cook than talk. But what I find to be even easier than cooking is being with you. You are like a ray of tropical sunshine. You can brighten my day just with one smile. I thought I enjoyed making chili, but I realize I enjoy watching you eat it even more. You are the ingredient I didn't know was missing in my life. I hope you feel the same. Yours, James." Lexi's hands trembled as she reread the last 2 lines. This could only mean. This malasada is good. Very authentic, Mrs. Turner cooed, her lips covered with a light sprinkling of powdered sugar. I am pleasantly surprised. Me, too, Ma. Lexi smiled, her cheeks warming. She couldn't have said it better herself. James had managed to surprise her in the most pleasant way. He had the biggest heart, even if he didn't know how to express everything in it. I think James wants more than friendship. And so do I. Isn't that what I've been saying this whole time? Her mother rolled her eyes. Go on then, find him. And tell him I want this malasada recipe. Lexi bounced on her tiptoes, a surge of energy pumping through her veins as if she'd eaten the whole box of donuts herself. But it wasn't a sugar high coursing through her, it was pure love. Every cell in her body ached to see James, to be near him. She threw on her boots and grabbed her purse before calling out goodbye to her mother. Now it was her chance to surprise James. Chapter 20. James. James leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The noise on the tour bus had died down now that the band members were resting their voices. He knew these downtimes were few and far in between, and he made sure to take the opportunity to put his feet up when he wasn't cooking. It was hard to sit still, however, when all he wanted to do was check his phone. He hadn't heard back from Lexi since he left her the voicemail an hour ago. That couldn't be a good thing. Doubts and worries flooded his mind as he wondered what she must be thinking. He clenched and unclenched his hands, debating whether to call her again. But he couldn't ignore the fact that the distance between them was increasing mile by mile, minute by minute. There wasn't much he could do besides waiting and hoping. The bus suddenly slowed down and turned right, coming to a complete stop after a few seconds. James opened his eyes to see a rest stop sign through the tinted window beside him. He glanced around, curious to know why they had stopped. They were still an hour from their destination. Toward the front of the bus, the tour manager and Adam talked in hushed voices, glancing at James from time to time. Adam finally walked over, a grin spreading across his lips. "Is everything okay?" James asked him. "We've still got an hour's drive until Houston." "Yeah, we're good. Just making a pit stop so the driver can stretch his legs." Bending over, he looked out the window as if scanning the gravel and dirt parking lot for someone. When he straightened, he fixed his eyes on James. "You feeling homesick already?" James smirked. "You can tell? You don't have that same excitement you did the first time you came on tour with us. I get it though, your heart's not in it. You'd rather be someplace else, with someone else," he added with a wink. "Yeah, I would," he answered simply. That was the truth. He didn't know how he was supposed to get through this next month or more without seeing Lexi. At this point, he'd settle for hearing her voice or even getting a text from her. James glanced at the phone in his hand, willing it to ring. "I think someone else feels the same way as you," Adam piped up, just as James's phone rang. "I'll let you get that." James looked down to see Lexi's beautiful face appear on the screen. He immediately swiped to answer it. "Hello? James." Lexi's sweet voice with her usual enthusiastic lilt came over the line. "I'm sorry I missed your calls and texts, my phone was off." "No problem. I'm glad you called. It's so good to hear your voice." "Yours too. How's your mom? Is she feeling better?" "She's good, we're good. We had a talk and I understand her better now. She cares a lot more than she lets on. She just has a funny way of showing it." James scoffed softly. It seemed he and Lexi's mother had more in common than he thought. "I get that. It's not always easy to express how you feel for someone." "Yes, I'm seeing that. Oh, she really enjoyed your malasadas. That was really sweet of you to make them for me, James." "Thank you. So you, opened the box?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. It was easier to state the obvious than to tackle the real questions on his mind. "Of course, I opened it, James." She chuckled. "Friends don't let friends throw away good food." "Yeah, of course." James waited, hoping Lexi would volunteer more information. His mouth grew dry as he anticipated her response. When she didn't elaborate, he took a deep breath and asked, "Did you see the note?" "Yes." Her tone grew soft and breathy. "I read the note word for word." "Humph," James murmured an indiscernible sound. He had no idea what to say now. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the muscles tensing there. Was it time to lay all the cards on the table? He had to if he wanted a future with Lexi. "So, what did you think?" "I thought it was beautiful," Lexi began, a smile in her voice. "It was so heartfelt and sweet, everything you wrote." James released the breath he'd been holding. "I'm glad you thought so. I meant every word." "I know, James. That's why I had to come give you my reply, in person." "In person?" James shook his head, not believing her words. When he lifted his head, his jaw dropped. Standing outside his window, in a pair of jeans and a white tank top, was Lexi. A flush in her cheeks made her creamy complexion even more beautiful in contrast to her dark hair. She greeted him with a bright smile that made his whole body warm. He turned off his phone and ran off the bus as quickly as his feet would take him, straight to her side. "How did you find us?" Lexi put her phone away in her pocket and smiled. I have connections. Nana gave me the number you left her for emergencies, and I talked to Lana, your tour manager. Turns out she and the band thought you could use a visit from a friend. A friend, right? James swallowed hard as he blinked against the midday sun. There were so many emotions running through his body, he had a hard time thinking. But one thing he knew he wanted to make clear was the fact that he wanted more than friendship. I wish I'd said this months ago, or even yesterday. What is it, James? Lexi, I know we're good at playing pretend and fooling people into thinking we're dating, but the thing is, I don't want to pretend anymore. You don't want to pretend anymore, she repeated, her voice breathless. What do you want, James? He brought a hand to Lexi's cheek and caressed her soft skin with his thumb. She leaned against his palm, the warmth from her cheek heating his entire body. The tenderness in her eyes urged him to speak honestly. I want to be real. I want to be the one who cooks you chili every day. I want to be there for you when you need a shoulder to cry on, and the one who steps on your feet when we dance. I want all the highs and the lows, and I want them with you. Does this make any sense? It makes perfect sense. She nodded. You want to be us. Us. Yes, that's it. I want to be us. He smiled, happy and relieved to finally be able to express himself. Now that she understood his heart, he wanted to understand hers. What about you, Lex? What do you want? Biting her lower lip, she stepped nearer, closing the space between them. Her dark brown eyes twinkled with hope. It's simple. I want to be someone who finally knows what she wants and goes after it. I want to start living without regrets. Most of all, I want to be the beach bum who fell for the handsome cowboy she met on her first day in Texas. I want us, too, James. James didn't need to think twice. He took her into his arms, holding her close as he buried his face in her soft hair. The moment couldn't have been better, except for one thing. I think you and I both left something out. She pulled back, amusement flickering across her face. What else is there? Here, I'll show you. James tilted Lexi's chin up and leaned in. He claimed her mouth with his, gently and passionately pouring the emotions welling in his chest. She gasped softly as he pulled her against him, her soft curves melding into his firm torso. She tasted as sweet and wonderful as he'd imagined, like milk and honey on a warm spring day. As he deepened the kiss, she reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck. Her fingers played with the ends of his hair until the two of them pulled apart at the sound of cheers and whistles coming through the open bus doors. Lexi laughed. I think everyone got that message loud and clear. James smiled, feeling his cheeks redden. I probably won't hear the end of this from the guys. He paused, a bittersweet feeling settling in his chest. If only we'd figured things out before I took this job. I wish I didn't have to be away from Sage Valley, from you. What if you don't have to be? Lexi asked, her eyes wide. From me, at least, for a little while. Nana and Bucky offered to let me take a vacation before summer starts. And Lana said I could work for room and board by being the behind-the-scenes tour photographer for the band's social media accounts. I'll be on the road with you guys for the next 2 weeks, if that's okay with you? That's more than okay. James pulled Lexi close to place another kiss on her pink lips. I could use some help in the kitchen, too, from someone who's familiar with chili. Lexi beamed. I know the perfect person for that job. James couldn't agree more. He took Lexi's hands in his, ready and eager to embark on their new journey together. Epilogue. 1 month later. Lexi. Lexi spotted the familiar outline of a navy blue pickup truck as it rounded the bend of the road leading up to Sage Valley. The man in the driver's seat came into view as the vehicle neared. Her heart skipped a beat in excitement. Her cowboy was finally home. 2 weeks had passed since she last saw James, and even though they spoke several times a day on the phone, it felt like they'd been apart twice as long. James had only found out 2 days ago that the band had found his replacement. Since then, Lexi had been waiting impatiently for his return. She raced toward the parking area, moving so quickly, she didn't see the squawking rooster crossing the road. With an inch to spare, she stopped herself from plowing into the bird. Elvis. Not today, buddy. No person, or rooster, is getting in the way of me and my man. She waved the bird aside with a loud shoo and dodged her way around him. When she looked ahead, she spotted the man she'd been waiting 14 days and 3 hours to kiss again. With a sprint, she bounded into his open arms. James. He held her close, his strong arms enveloping her in a tight embrace. I missed you so much, sweetheart. Lexi pulled back and looked into the bright blue eyes of the man she'd come to know and love even more this past month. Standing on her tiptoes, she cupped her hands on his cheeks and pulled him in for a kiss. His masculine scent, the light stubble along his jawline, and the richness of his voice, she'd missed it all so much. I'm so glad you're home. It hasn't been the same without you. Without me or my chili, he asked in a teasing tone. With one hand, he grabbed his duffel bag from the truck and hitched it over his shoulder. He held Lexi's hand with the other as they made their way past the parking lot. She wrinkled her nose in chagrin. Both. None of the kitchen staff could figure out your secret ingredient. Believe me, they tried everything they could think of. They've all decided you're not allowed to go anywhere again without telling someone. James chuckled. Don't worry. I don't plan on leaving Sage Valley anytime soon. I wouldn't dream of leaving you again. He brought her hand up to his lips for a kiss. But telling someone isn't a bad idea. I've been thinking of doing that, so why not today? Her brows shot up as she eyed him in surprise. I thought it was for family only. It is. Do you have a long-lost brother or sister I don't know about? Or maybe a distant cousin? No and no. He pressed his lips together, his complexion reddening. What's going on, James? James shot her a shy smile before coming to a stop in front of the door to the mess hall. Maybe it's easier if I show you. Come on. Lexi followed him to the kitchen. Once inside, James set his bag and hat aside and rolled up the sleeves of his button-down shirt. He began opening cabinets and pulling out a variety of dried spices. Containers of coriander, cumin, paprika, cayenne, and oregano soon filled up the counter. At the very end of the line sat one rectangular dark brown container. It looked out of place, yet James didn't blink an eye. What's that? She asked, pointing to the last item. He picked up the box and handed it to her. This, he announced with a smile, is the secret ingredient. Lexi turned the container over and read the words unsweetened cocoa. Are you serious? I never would have guessed it. How much do you add? 2 teaspoons. That's all it takes, but it makes a world of difference. It does. Sighing happily, she set the box down. I feel so privileged to know your secret. You must really trust me, she added with a grin. I do trust you, Lexi. You are the only woman I feel completely at ease with, he stated, despite the uncertainty clouding his features. Being apart from you these past 2 weeks only confirmed what I already knew. You're the only woman I'd want to give the secret ingredient to. Which is why. James? Lexi's mouth fell open as she watched James fall to one knee. What are you doing? James took a black velvet box from his jacket pocket and opened it to reveal a diamond solitaire ring. He presented the ring to Lexi with a hopeful smile. I'm making sure the secret ingredient stays within the family. Alexandra Mingzhu Turner, will you let me cook chili for you for the rest of my life? Will you marry me? It only took Lexi 2 seconds to digest the question and answer him with an enthusiastic yes. She fell to her knees beside James and held out her hand to him. He slid the ring onto her finger and began their engagement with a sweet kiss. I love you, Lexi. I always have, and I always will. I love you, too, James, even more than your chili, she added playfully. James chuckled. That's good to know. And don't worry, your secret is safe with me, she promised with her whole heart. Lexi gazed at the handsome young cowboy who gave her everything she could ever want, a firm shoulder to cry on, a soft place to land, and the sweetest kisses she'd ever received. James was her home as much as Sage Valley Ranch was. She knew without a doubt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her past, with all of its twists and turns, had led her to this place and to this day. There was so much to look forward to now. A future, and endless bowls of chili, with her best friend? Nothing could be more delicious. The end. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. To learn more about Liwen Ho's other books, please visit her website at liwenho.com.